Hello everyone, I'm Rebecca Arnold and I teach dress history here at the Collaborators Institute. And I'm going to be introducing today's program and also our keynote speaker, Moyes Ferreira. This is a two-day conference entitled Unravelling Threads, Tracing and Transforming Violence and Trauma Through Fashion. Thank you to all of our participants for being here with us. We've got such a wonderful array of people and we're really just so thankful and honoured to have all of you being here with us today. And thank you also to everyone for attending. I know some of you have been setting your alarm clocks to be here from the other side of the world. So thank you to every single one of you for attending. It's really fantastic. We're so pleased to have you all here with us and to bring attention to such an amazing group of speakers. It's a two-day online conference. So today, obviously, we are starting at 11:30 and we'll finish at 5:30. And please note, tomorrow we'll start a little bit earlier at 10:30 and end at 5:30. Now, the conference was organised by Moyes Ferreira with a bit of help from me. And we did this in our capacity as members of the Documenting Fashion group here at the Collaborators Institute. And we oversee all of the fashion-related events here. And you are going to meet, I think, pretty much all of our members across the 2 days because they've very kindly agreed to chair each session, which is really lovely. And also some of them will be hosting the plenary session at the end of tomorrow's sessions, where they will pick up on themes and ideas that they want to highlight from the 2 days and can discuss with all of you. We want it to be a very open discussion, so we will have the chat on at all times, and please do drop your comments and questions into that as we go through the day. We've allowed for a good amount of discussion after each person has spoken, so we will get through as many of the questions and comments then as we can, but please know that we will also pass on the chat to all of our speakers as well at the end of each day. And I know myself, it's very, very nice to get that at the end of the day, especially for an online session, so you know what people have been thinking and saying while you've been talking and discussing. I obviously want to thank Lucy for initiating this idea and for doing 99% of the work to get the conference together. So thank you so much, Lucy. And I'm so pleased that this represents us collaborating, which is always lovely, but also our two institutions, London College of Fashion and the Collaborators Institute. And I want to thank Ellen Smith from LCF, who has helped with a lot of the administrative side of organisation from that institution, and also the Collaborators' wonderful research forum, Acacia, Layla and Grace, who are there behind the scenes making sure everything happens. So thank you to all of them. Now, the subject matter for these 2 days was prompted by Lucy's recent book and her work on fashion and violence in the interwar period. And what we wanted to do was broaden out from her innovative study of the ways in which in the period she's looking at, the flu pandemic, the First World War, and the threat of another global conflict impacted the ways that dress was used as both in reaction to violence and trauma, but also as solace. Unfortunately, these themes are even more pertinent than ever today. And so we've gathered together this diverse range of speakers who will open up the contemplation of, and I'm quoting Lucy here, she puts this very eloquently in the conference notes. She says, fashion sits intimately upon the skin, functioning as a barrier between the self and the outside world, with the ability to offer notions of both physical and psychological protection. Yet it is also inherently revelatory and can express our feelings and experiences or mould them and communicate how we would like to be perceived. And I think these are ideas that we can take forward over the 2 days and consider in relation to each of the specific case studies that our speakers will present. She goes on to say, Lucy, I'm quoting you again, we can consider these ideas in relation to varied case studies, which is what we're going to be doing, to be set forward today, but also to think about, as Lucy says, the kind of relationship between fashion, trauma, and contexts. And we'll be seeing a number of different kinds of contexts over these 2 days. And we're going to begin actually with Lucy. I want to move on to introduce Moyes Ferreira to you now. She is lecturer in fashion media at London College of Fashion. And her research focuses on fashion and beauty and their relationship to media, psychology, and to art. Her recent publications include her book, which is brilliant, so you must get her book, Danger in the Path of Chic, Violence in Fashion Between the Wars, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. And this year, she has published A Seductive Weapon and Necessary Luxury, Shopping for Designer Perfume During the Interwar Period, which is in a book called Shopping and the Senses by Palgrave Macmillan. And today she's going to take out a focused part from her book, and her talk is, her keynote paper, that's what I'm trying to say. Her keynote paper is entitled Shadows, Skeletons and Spectres, Deathliness Within Interwar Fashion. So thank you so much, Lucy, for kicking off the conference for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Rebecca, and for all your help in organising this conference. And I'd love to extend that to everybody at the Courtauld and London College of Fashion who've been so helpful in helping us put all of this together. And lastly, thank you so much to everybody who's here, who's attending, who's speaking and sharing. We're really grateful, and I'm so excited to see how the conference progresses and to hear all of your wonderful ideas. So I'm going to start by talking to you about a section from my book, but I'm going to expand on some ideas that are there. So I'm examining deathliness within interwar fashion in Britain, France, and the US. And it's really sort of enhancing some of the ideas that I wrote in the 4th chapter of my book, and included some new images and some new ideas. So really thinking about how these ideas were functioning in the 20s and 30s. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how that's actually going to extend as we sort of progress over the 2 days of this conference. So let me share my slides with you now. So I hope you can all see these images okay. So I'm going to begin the talk now. A grey figure floats ominously in the air. It raises its wide arms above its head, its costume draping downwards and ending in feather-like fringing, evoking wings. One of its hands clutches an hourglass, with sand racing through its chamber to signify the passing of time. In the other is a scythe as tall as the figure itself, with a large, sharply pointed blade. It forms a clear representation of the Grim Reaper, the very personification of death. All of the traditional elements of the character are included, which had appeared as early as the 15th century in English mythology, as a spectre who visits a victim before his or her death, in some versions causing the death, and in others to guide them to the afterlife. This character made frequent appearances during the 1920s in a wide range of sources. It was used as a means through which to refer to death within literature, including novels and magazines, and was also referred to in official documents, such as governmental papers. Whilst the personification was therefore not uncommon during the period, the context of this image pictured was highly unusual. It was an illustration that appeared in the Gazette du Bon Ton in 1920, nestled amongst traditional fashion plates and presented as though it was merely another style for consideration. The face appearing from within the costume, with its feminine features and its rouged cheeks, is the only aspect that links it to what might be more typically expected within the prestigious fashion and culture magazine. Death and fashion have shared a long-standing relationship over history, and dress traditionally played a crucial and well-defined role within the mourning process. One of the most widespread and tangible traumatic consequences of the First World War was the catastrophic number of deaths, which had a significant impact upon women and culture. Bereavements were no longer suffered on a solely individual basis, but experienced en masse instead. The First World War brought about harrowing absence. Monumental losses of almost 3 million military personnel and civilians were suffered altogether in France, the UK, and the US. This marked the deadliest conflict that had ever been experienced by a vast margin at the time. The war's impact on interwar attitudes towards death was also profound. The devastating losses and their continued and significant impact on society were openly acknowledged. For example, in 1920, Kurt Morgan emphasized, "We have just emerged from a devastating war. We haven't, we are just emerging." Furthermore, the impact of the 1918 flu pandemic shouldn't be forgotten either. The pandemic lasted from 1918 until December 1920, and actually resulted in considerably more deaths than the war itself, between 50 and 100 million deaths across the world, including very vast numbers in Britain, France, and America alike. This epidemic therefore gravely contributed to the widespread grief that was experienced during this period. The war also had a practical impact upon fashion's relationship with death. Vogue published 2 articles on mourning dress in 1922 and 1927, for example. We're going to use those now as a point of comparison. Although each covered the subject in detail, the author in 1922 didn't mention the war directly, and instead merely described the changes in style. By 1927, however, enough distance from the conflict had been gained that the vast impact that it had on the customs of mourning clothing could actually be articulated explicitly. The author explained the severity of its impact on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The First World War had a great deal to do with this change, I quote. Mourning was abandoned by many people at that time out of consideration for others, since a universal wearing of black as an expression of sorrow would have been unthinkably depressing to the public. And women in America and England acquired a new viewpoint on this subject. They came to feel that they should not withdraw entirely from active life, except for a brief period, nor should they give themselves up to intimate and somber exclusion, wrapped up in deep lineaments of woe. Due to the total war nature of the conflict, grief struck massive numbers of the population at once, rather than being a more individualistic or family-based experience in which mourning dress could distinguish a bereaved individual and then allow them to be treated appropriately by others in public. But as a result of the war, loss affected so many that it became a majority rather than a minority, which required a shift in attitude. What did this mean practically in terms of dress? In 1922, British Vogue explained that a generation ago, there were absolutely strict rules for mourning. And in this respect, no one who believed in the propriety of the conventions would have broken them. Today, every phase of life is being re-examined in the light of individual opinion, so that even mourning has become a largely question of personal feeling, and the ultimate decision rests with the individual. There was the decided abbreviation of the time that is worn, and I quote there, which had previously been 2 years of full mourning and half mourning for life or until a second marriage. But by 1922, as Vogue said, the widow rarely actually wore the long veil for more than a year, and some young widows, and even a few of the old ones, now consider 6 months alone a sufficient period of deep mourning. So a big shift there, and Vogue labelled it a very modern interpretation. Discreet jewelry, such as fine pearls, were acceptable, except for during the initial deepest mourning period. The writer explained that the 2 reasons for wearing mourning are to show respect for the person who has died and for the protection of the person who is wearing it. Dress was used, therefore, to communicate a twofold message. Firstly, it made the status of the bereaved wearer known and allowed them to receive that appropriate social reception, as I just mentioned. And secondly, wearing a colour that represented a deprivation of light was a clear link to the deprivation of the life of the deceased. This indicated that, despite their absence, they were still considered and commemorated in the present. Style was also an important consideration in mourning dress. Vogue cautioned in its 1922 article, for instance, that above all, it's important that the apparel of mourning should always be in good taste. Mourning wear took on elements of fashion, such as straight necklines, dropped waists, tubular shapes, and long necklaces, as you can see in this example. The unprecedented circumstances of the war built upon a long-standing relationship between fashion and death, and further developed it in an entirely new way. the widespread mourning that was undergone simultaneously at mass levels due to the war's abundance of losses also impacted the nature of mourning dress. Previously, when a woman wore a predominance of the colour black, it was strongly linked to death and could be read as a clear sign of mourning. However, this is to change. In 1916, for example, a black dress would not have been received as the height of fashion, as it would be later when Chanel popularized her little black dress in 1926. This was the first time we get this concept. While the black outfits produced in the years immediately following the war may now be looked back upon as being chic, this association wouldn't have been made at the time, and smart black outfits were reserved for mourning. However, with the war, thousands of mourners all wore black mourning outfits at the same time. So rather than being an individual event, it was carried out by necessity on a mass scale. This broke through the link between death and black. Because it was no longer solitary, black began to be reconceptualized and be seen as a more standard option for dress that could have fashionable potential. The increasing fashionability of mourning dress would only soar with passing years. By 1927, the increasingly lenient attitudes towards mourning of 1922 had loosened even further. The most important change by this stage was the fact that no one need not wear clothes that are distinctly mourning clothes. And a quote from this article you can see. The clothes that are in best taste for a woman in mourning are those that would be chic and correct for any woman. The writer even announced, mourning may be chic. This was helped by what they referred to as the present mode, which was so simple that a large number of smart dresses were entirely suitable for mourning, and the magazine advised that elaboration is not smart for any type. Rather, the tucks, pleats, and skillful cut sponsored by such designers as Vianney and Chanel are ideal means of giving distinction to the mourning frock. As a result, since mourning had become so much less spectacular, it was no longer necessary to go to a shop that sells nothing else, Vogue said, and appropriate outfits could be purchased from the usual fashionable shops. The stark appearance of the Grim Reaper within the Gazette du Bon Ton had been a product of overwhelming trauma, which was still extremely recent and raw. However, as the 1920s progressed and attitudes towards mourning dress and its protocols changed, this began to be swept away and repressed. At the end of the decade, though, Elsa Schiaparelli, produced a sweater in which a figure of death starkly emerged once more. So we have this idea that mourning wear is moving away from being so closely associated with death and becoming more in line with fashion and celebrated as being chic. So Schiaparelli comes in and puts death right at the forefront of fashion once more. As she described in her autobiography, white lines on the sweater followed the design of the ribs, so that women wearing it gave the appearance of being seen through an X-ray. By her own admission, this was a skeleton sweater which shocked the newspapers. She also mentioned, this is Schiaparelli in her autobiography, that it hit the newspapers, which then took little notice of fashion. So even though they weren't taking so much notice of fashion, Schiaparelli actually was featured. So on the 6th of January 1929, the Chicago Tribune, as you can see here, featured a fashion illustration that includes one of the only surviving representations of the skeleton sweater, as you can see here on the second figure from the left. The illustration, while simple, clearly denoted the white lines upon the black sweater, which evoked the bones of a female skeleton. However, only once does the author mention the fact that novelty in sports clothes was not absent. Although by this, she referred to the new Paris collections at large, rather than Schiaparelli's piece in particular. On one hand, The lack of reference to the sweater's unique theme could be attributed to the general nature of the publication, as a mainstream newspaper rather than a specialized fashion or women's magazine. However, the author included considerably more details than other garments featured within the article. So deliberately or not, the rich subject matter of Schiaparelli's skeleton sweater goes unmentioned, as if exploring its implications would have been too difficult or disturbing and were more comfortably repressed rather than acknowledged. Certainly, the transformation that the sweater brought about, turning its wearer into a living skeleton, entailed a stark reminder of the losses faced by society at large. After the war, the topic of death had been very prevalent within many forms of culture. However, as the 1920s progressed, various attempts were made to move away from this unsettling subject. Women were instructed, both implicitly and explicitly, that it was no longer popular or proper to dwell on grief, and instead they should focus on a new, faster-paced modern lifestyle. This shift in attitude and expectation was even reflected in mourning dress, which, as we have just seen, transformed so much that it became indistinguishable from current fashion. In her skeleton sweater, Schiaparelli drew upon this tension, which didn't disappear and instead lurked under the surface, despite conventional media's attempts to repress it. Knowingly, she quite literally placed it upon wearers' chests as walking reminders and embodiments of what was being repressed. The body was turned inside out, and matters that were banished to a subconscious level were displayed so that they could no longer be dismissed. This was characteristic of Schiaparelli's use of irony. As death became more oppressed and more integrated into the everyday, Schiaparelli placed it as a striking feature upon such a popular garment. The fact that the sweater was classed as sportswear increases the sense of irony, for Schiaparelli used death as the major fashion design feature within a category of clothing that traditionally celebrates the muscular, healthy, living body and is worn widely. Moving on to the 1930s, death also appeared within explorations of the shadow and its effects in fashion photography throughout the decade, by photographers including Man Ray and Cecil Beaton, for example. In publications such as Vogue in France, Britain, and America alike, it became common to shoot models before a plain white background with dramatic lighting to deliberately cast an overt shadow, her own enlarged silhouette or shadow self, to take some sort of psychology, some psychoanalytical terms that were concurrently being developed. So this idea of the shadow self looming over the model. Occasionally, the projected shadow didn't reflect the model herself. And in this example from 1934 in French Vogue, it was a photograph in which the model shadow actually consisted of feathered shapes, which didn't correlate with her outfit. They were jutting out behind her as if they were shadowy wings. They presented an entirely different side to that of her body itself, which was carefully styled and posed to present a highly controlled and polished manner. This dualism between a restrained and unbridled self corresponded to the binary that was being examined in contemporary psychoanalysis, which was a newly emerging and newly popularized discipline between Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self and public persona. And in 1935, Cecil Beaton took this trend even further. Miss Sheldon poses before a blank white backdrop, her arm outstretched to model a shawl by Maggie. Behind, the shadows of three men who are not visible in the flesh loom over her, two of them with arms and hands poised towards her. It's left ambiguous as to whether she is aware of their presence and whether they are about to attack or are being actively summoned by her. Her pose is deliberate, defiant, and confident, as if she retains control. Furthermore, the third shadow holds a cigarette, adding an element of social frivolity. This increasing use of shadows within fashion photography has particular significance at the moment in history in which they appeared. This trend began following the Wall Street crash and grew in the midst of the Great Depression, which would last until 1939, with a devastating international impact that went far beyond just the United States, including both France and the United Kingdom. This directly correlated with the increasing appearance and exploration of the shadow in fashion photography in all three countries. Indeed, the interplay between presence and absence conjured by these images resonated on a macro as well as an individual level. While shooting high fashion represented glamour and evoked occasions of fun and decadence where they may be worn, the appearance of shadows suggested the bleak reality that millions were living as a result of the extreme economic difficulties, ever present and looming, even when they couldn't explicitly be seen. In Beaton's photograph, Miss Sheldon's floor-length gown and long gloves illustrate this sense of glamour in the face of adversity, and the Depression is an important contextual factor in this aesthetic development. By 1935, this aesthetic became common within mainstream fashion photography. That year, for example, Horst P. Horst explored it in his Hair/Lace, featuring actress Helen Bennett. In 1938, he photographed Bunny Hartley sitting with her legs in a cross position, as you can see here. Whilst her right hand was placed serenely upon her lap, her left hand was held out before her at a right angle to her body. Whilst the pose as a whole had calm, meditative associations, this was cancelled by her left hand, which forms a blocking gesture. However, what gave the photograph its menacing impact was once more the use of shadow. The light was deliberately directed so as to cast an oversized shadow directly behind her, which loomed out above. Furthermore, objects appeared in shadow that were not present physically within the frame, including organic, flower-like shapes. Their linear quality and horizontal lines behind her served to add to a sense of restriction, and they could be covered with thorns or act like barbed wire. The fact that only their shadows were present created a ghostly atmosphere, and the viewer was shown the spectre, but not what it belonged to, heightening a sense of threatening absence. However, the most violent element of this absence appeared upon Bunny's own face. The dark black shadow of a hand curved its way around the entirety of her face, blocking her eyes, nose, and mouth, and therefore obliterating her senses and means of speaking, and even figuratively prevents her from breathing. Logically, we can see that the shadow belonged to her own outstretched hand, which tried to assertively block an outsider from touching her as a means of protection. In the dark world of shadowy absence, however, the other had broken through and appeared to smother her. From the mid-1930s, the relationship between fashion and deathliness began to become even more literal, visceral, and thematic. And in addition to informing aspects of fashion media, began to play a main role within dress and fashion design. Schiaparelli had already begun to explore the aesthetic and the expressive potential of the skeleton towards the beginning of her career with her skeleton sweater, as we discussed. In 1937, the theme appeared again as an important aspect of her oeuvre. That year, Paris hosted the World's Fair, in which Schiaparelli and other prominent Parisian couturiers participated. Schiaparelli deliberately subverted the traditional conservative elegance of her peers that was present in the rest of the pavilion in her display, and she created an alarming spectacle from the very conditions that were prescribed. Her setup created such alarm and panic precisely because it enacted to viewers a funeral scene. Schiaparelli staged a mannequin as if it were a corpse. Harper's Bazaar reported that a bereavement card was even placed at the scene. At the exhibition, Schiaparelli constructed a scene of death that explored the rituals that society surrounds it with. It was a dignified comment on the ceremony that society itself constructs around death as a means through which to process it. Seeing an artificial imitation of this process within the context of the exhibition's fashion pavilion was an unexpected encounter, allowing the bourgeois audience to consider the pomp and formalities that death had conventionally necessitated. This focus on the artificial elements of the funeral rituals was further exaggerated by the fact that Schiaparelli highlighted and played with the state of the mannequin itself, uncannily oscillating upon the boundary of life and death. Man-made inorganic materials are in their very nature unliving, yet when constructed as a mannequin, they're designed to resemble and even replace the living human body. This strongly correlated with Walter Benjamin's observations on the links between fashion and death, which he was forming at approximately the same time when working on his Arcades project. An entire section was devoted to fashion, where he laid out his argument for death being at fashion's very core. And he says, "For fashion was never anything but the parody of the gaily decked out corpse." He equated this with fashion's primary existence as seasonal, temporal, and fleeting, comprised of solely trends, which eventually die and are replaced with new ones, he claimed. He asserted that fashion lowers, and I quote, "lowers the barriers between the organic and the inorganic world." So it's really able to create a sense of desire towards an inorganic product. Schiaparelli, with her deathly setup, directly performed and exaggerated his argument. Any admirers of her couture on display would be in actual fact admiring a deathly funeral scene. For Benjamin, fashion prostitutes the living body to the inorganic world, and Schiaparelli highlighted this assertion and took it even further by using the shock of a deathly body to reveal the interplay between unliving garments and the living body within the usual course of fashion. Benjamin argued that the modern woman could use fashion to resist the natural aging and eventual death of the human body, which likens them to a mannequin and turns them themselves into his gaily decked out corpse. This gaily decked out corpse was precisely what Schiaparelli's display evoked and can therefore be read as a comment on the nature of fashion and its relationship with death. The following year, in her circus collection of 1938, Schiaparelli returned to deathliness and decay within the body itself with her skeleton dress. Jet black silk clings to the skin and covers the entirety of the wearer's body in sheathed darkness. Each part of the body, from the shoulders to each limb, were fully enclosed, creating a second skin. In addition to the uncanny quality that this constriction provided, already conflating the states of living and unliving by giving an inorganic material uncomfortable organic qualities, this effect was dramatically heightened by the addition of bones. Upon the surface of the matte silk, quilting was employed and exaggerated to create a skeletal anatomy on the exterior of the body. 6 pairs of diagonal lines upon the chest, from the front and the back, serve as ribs, and further raised ridges indicate bones for the waist, legs, back, and spine on both sides of the dress, so that the skeleton was apparent to viewers whether they faced the wearer directly or not. She had collaborated with Salvador Dali, who produced an original sketch on the theme, which included skeletons wearing draped, transparent dress with prominent bones. They're arranged in a very similar manner to those on Schiaparelli's final design. At the bottom of the drawing, he wrote a note to Schiaparelli, suggesting that the pair had discussed their ideas on the theme together previously. Schiaparelli's design, with its matching bone structure, appears to have developed directly from this initial sketch. The skeleton dress itself conjures really macabre, sinister, and deathly connotations that seem to go even further in exploring death on the body. Certainly, the silk material selected in matte is specifically material that was suited to mourning wear. It was also designed with a hat that built on the outfit's aesthetic of mourning, which featured a black veil in the shape of a circus tent topped with a cap. Furthermore, Caroline Evans has argued that images of the internal body are always associated with death. Here I quote Caroline. Before the advent of modern medicine, with its new technologies for imaging the body, the sight of the inside of the body was always an encounter with death. Today, despite medical advances, it still retains some of that charge, and a visual encounter with the inside of the body may be an encounter with disease and pathology. End quote. Schiaparelli produced her dress in between these two sides. Whilst X-ray technology was initially discovered at the end of the 19th century, it wasn't until the mid-1920s that safety precautions began to be seriously recommended. And it would take over 3 further decades for them to approach universal adoption. Its harmful effects remained highly prevalent during the 30s when Schiaparelli was designing. Therefore, Schiaparelli explored the technology to a point where it was still extremely harmful and relatively little understood, despite having existed for 3 decades. By turning the body inside out with her skeleton dress, she drew upon both associations of glimpsing into the internal body, both the pre-modern medicine link with death and the medically advanced link to disease and pathology. This was further fraught by the state of X-ray technology in the 1930s. It was widely used and its dangers were well reported, but ideal safety practice hadn't yet been implemented. The skeleton dress enabled its wearer to embody death on multiple levels, from traditional mourning wear to associations with the dead or the diseased body, and the added fear of a still dangerous medical technology employed in sickness. This allowed Schiaparelli to subvert traditional evening wear. While the fabric clung to the body, which was common in contemporary fashion and allowed a sensual display of the body's contours, Schiaparelli inverted this by revealing not just womanly curves, but the very bones underneath. In this way, she could toy with the male gaze, which expected to be rewarded with sexual pleasure by penetrating clothing to reveal the naked body beneath, but instead was taken deeper and exposed to the visceral skeleton that exists beneath, a theme that ran through much of Schiaparelli's work. In this way, the skeleton dress transformed its wearer into the embodiment of the femme fatale, initially attracting men through their sexuality, but ensnaring them with the incarnation of death. With her skeleton dress, Schiaparelli exposed this repression, freeing women's sexuality from capitalist restraint and forced society to be confronted by death. So again, continuing what she was doing with her skeleton sweater back in the 20s and really addressing what fashion was doing by sort of pushing death below the surface, with society trying to move away from the trauma. She was really making it stand out again and forcing it to be faced. She did this not only by making the skeleton or the corpse itself a fundamental design aspect, but also by candidly linking it to contemporary fashion and the suffering that it demanded beneath the surface upon women's real, living bodies. In his 1939, The Practice of Joy Before Death, Georges Bataille noted that in traditional society, when women are made passive, as taboos are artificially created by men, who then primarily desire to transgress it, he argued, through violence and death. Schiaparelli's skeleton dress therefore transferred this power directly onto the female body. In this way, it could serve the dress, it could serve as both protection and empowerment. This sense of feminine empowerment mounted within Schiaparelli's work over the 1930s, and it reached its peak at this point at the end of the decade, as the Second World War began to loom. Her protective, empowering dress could shield women from the dangers within society. This could provide comfort, figuratively, as the turbulent political scene unfolded, offering a sense of stability in the face of a world that was once again shifting, having hardly recovered from the devastation of the First World War. In addition, its fundamentally deathly aesthetic could ward off the traditional fear and taboo of death, and instead acknowledge and liberate it, sparking Bataille's concept of joy before death. Thank you very much. That's the end of my paper, and I'd love to hear any comments or questions. I'd love to have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was, I don't know if you can hear me. That was so fascinating. And we have got a couple of, well, one's a comment, one's a question that I think are really interesting. The first one is from Rosie Dyer. Thank you, Rosie. She says, what a fascinating exploration of the felt and the known. That's such a good way to put it, of the felt and the known in relation to the horsed image. And she says, whilst we know the hand shadow comes from Bunny herself, it certainly feels ominous and threatening. So that's really interesting. And then Katerina, hello Katerina, she has asked this. She says, was there a difference in how different generations of women approach death evoking or violent fashion? For example, mature society ladies versus young girls who would only have hazy memories of the First World War.
That is a really good point, Katerina. Thank you for bringing that up. But absolutely, I think there was quite a large difference in the generations, as we still know now. So the older generations might tend to hang on to what they were doing previously. They'll hang on to sort of older aesthetics or trends a bit longer. So sometimes you can almost tell when somebody was a teenager or when they're in their primes from the kind of the decade that you can see in their dress, even if it's in a completely different period in the contemporary. So I think that absolutely was happening at this time as well. And definitely with morning wear, I think sort of older women did approach it much more traditionally, and they would keep on the sort of the formal traditional rules and regulations, and perhaps wear morning wear a little bit more explicitly and for a bit longer. And it was the younger generations, it was the women who were sort of reading the fashion magazines and keeping up with trends that were influenced by the advice in magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar to be a bit more subtle and kind of push the morning wear level down a little bit. So I think there was, and also it should be said that these ideas of the visceral sense of death appearing within fashion design were very much at the sort of haute couture level. So it wasn't the everyday woman who was necessarily wearing this. It was the sort of higher society women who could afford to wear these designs. But nonetheless, it was affecting more widely than that, because it was appearing in the magazines that sort of people were reading on a very large scale. So it kind of came through in fashion media as well as actually being worn on the body. So I hope that helps, and thank you again, Katerina.
It's really interesting to think about that, to think about generational attitudes and different generations and how they approach dress and carrying things on their body. Ksenia, hello Ksenia, she says, thank you for a wonderful talk, Lucy. She really loved your book too. With regard to shadows, she's reminded of a Gazette du Bon Temps 1914 illustration, which features a large menacing shadow. She's very kindly sent us a link so we can click to find that. She says, as far as she understands, this predates Jung's theorization of the shadow self. Do you consider fashion's possible influence on psychoanalysis as well as the other way around?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your comment and the wonderful image. I absolutely love that one. And yeah, I really think the fashion can be influential on psychoanalysis and on many other sectors in society as well. And that's something I've really tried to sort of put forward and argue in my book, that fashion does have this power, and it's not just passive or reactive. It can be really sort of contributing towards different trends or feelings or moments in society and different advancements as well. So absolutely, it could have been a consideration for sure. And I think it's really, really interesting. I think this image that you kindly linked is a very, very lovely one. And it's interesting because being earlier in the period, so in 1914, the shadow, it's very explicit, it's overt, it's enlarged, but it does sort of follow the contours of the actual silhouette that we can see sort of with the woman drawn. Whereas as the 20s and 30s progressed, you start to get the shadows being even more outlandish and sort of even less representative of reality. So I think this is a really nice example to show that trend and kind of show how it started, and also across fashion illustration as well as fashion photography. So considering fashion media more widely. So thank you so much. That's really, really useful to add to the dialogue.
Because you're getting some great questions. Sephra, hello, Sephra, thank you. Just thank you for a wonderful presentation. The development of the narrative of death in fashion is fascinating. Are there other designers, apart from Schiaparelli, during the interwar period that utilize the theme of death within their designs?
Another lovely question, thank you. So I think Schiaparelli, from my research, is a sort of major figure in this. She was definitely the one who did it the most and the most overtly, but there definitely was an impact more widely amongst fashion designers and also fashion retail. So for example, Schiaparelli's setup at the Paris exhibition, it was actually quite similar to something that a store in America called Bonwit Teller actually did in their window display. They did something very, very similar. So that was actually on a more mass scale, slightly more for the everyday woman, and appearing actually on a city street where anybody could walk past and see. So you do get death coming in, especially examples like that. But I'd say it is a little bit more subtle. I think where there are clear links is this idea of sort of sheathing the body and creating this second skin, this kind of protective nature. And a lot of sort of late 1930s couture evening gowns, for example, we really do have that sense of sort of armor and protection coming through from the fabric and from the silhouette. So quite similar to the skeleton dress, but not necessarily with the actual ribs and skeleton sort of attached on top. So thank you.
Really interesting. And Alison, another great question. She says, what do you think of the skeletal deathly iconography of women's dress as a potentially problematic move towards a thinner body ideal in fashion at this time?
Thank you. That's another wonderful point. And yeah, you're spot on there. It really was happening. And that's something I do explore a little bit earlier in my book in chapter 3. I look at the sort of impact of fashion on the body and the way that fashion was demanding at times women to almost be quite violent to the way they treated their own bodies. And so the magazines would recommend actively violent exercise. They would use that word violence all the time. This idea of really hard and really conditioning your body. And that was very much happening. And also the idea that sort of around this time, sort of in the mid to late 30s, the actual designs really were very unforgiving. They were very, very difficult to wear. So these clothes forming the second skin, you couldn't get away with anything, you couldn't hide anything. So you really would be showing your true silhouette and even your skeletons that were very much on display. So I think there's a huge sort of correlation there. So thank you, Alison.
Such great questions, and thank you. There's quite a lot of Americans asking questions here, so they get extra points, and Canadians for being up so early in the morning. Another one is Claire. Hello, Claire. And she says this is such an interesting reference. Your observation and individual morning practice reminded me of the closing of Pale Horse, Pale Rider. The protagonist adopted deliberate costume after recovery from the influenza. And she says that she's always interpreted it as, sorry, it just jumped in as I was reading, always interpreted it as both mourning and defiance. And she wonders if you read it and if that's your interpretation too.
Oh, thank you so much. That's a wonderful suggestion. I'm going to go away and check that out. So thank you.
No, me too. I haven't read that either.
No, I'm definitely going to now. But I think at this point about fashion being both mourning and defiance, absolutely, I completely agree with that. And I think that's hopefully another theme that's going to come up quite a lot over these next 2 days with the conference, because fashion can be sort of reflect mourning, it can reflect our internal state, what's going on with us, but this sense of defiance is so powerful and so possible with fashion. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the most compelling aspects of fashion, is that it's inherently contradictory, and it's the fact that it's both things at the time, and that's at the same time, and that's what makes it powerful but also troubling. I think we should probably end there so that we can move on to our next session, but thank you so much, Lucy. That was so wonderful, so compelling, and has been a brilliant way to start these 2 days, and to open up the questions. And thank you, everyone. We're already getting amazing discussion and conversation. So thank you, everyone. And I will hand over now to Katerina, I think, yes, who is hosting the next session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Lucy. That was absolutely fabulous. And I think it's given us such a good start to the conference. And I'd like to now welcome you to our second session, which is Love is a Choice in the Midst of Trauma, Collision Collection, Fashion Film, and Behind the Scenes Footage. So imagine this, your car has been deemed a total loss, and every palpitation from it here on will bring you back to near death. You always were and still are in control. This is our world now. This is Collision. Rachel Corker Brown's fashion collection, Collision, started with not one, but 2 car crashes in a 3-month time span. These events shaped the designer and inspired them to funnel the post-traumatic stress into the creation of beautiful garments. Through movement, lighting, and set design, the Collision fashion film, choreographed by Acti, Constantino, and directed by Jonathan de Malkin, tells the complex story of the garments, as well as how they relate to mental health disorder. So now that we've heard a little bit about the film, I'm going to introduce the collaborators. So first of all, we have our designer, Rachel Corker Brown, and they are a British fashion designer based in London. Having studied fashion design in both London and New York, they have worked on a range of luxury designers and sustainable brands since graduating. Their graduate collection, Collision, was based on the trauma surrounding their first-hand experience of 2 car crashes. They have also worked on multiple independent films over the past couple of years, venturing into costume design and collaborating with art directors on their visions. And taking inspiration from everything around them, from broken and damaged objects, art subcultures, and emotions, Corker Brown sees beauty in things that others might overlook, creating unique garments with elements of unconventional tailoring and sculptural shapes. Increasingly, they're steering their work towards sustainable fashion. Then we have our choreographer, Acti Constantino, and she's also a performer and director. Acti was trained in ballet as a young child and studied at the National School of Dance in Athens for her foundation year, before moving on to complete a contemporary dance performance and choreography degree at Trinity College Laban in London. Since graduating, she's been working as both a choreographer and performer in the film and fashion industry, with a special emphasis on editorial and fashion campaigns. Recent projects include work with Another Magazine, Acne Paper, Vogue Italia, Flannels, and Kutasaka, ID, Nasty Magazine, and this is in addition to productions for the BBC, BFI, and Amazon Prime. And last but not least, we have Jonathan de Malkin, who's a freelance writer-director who weaves story through one common belief: the light is in you. You can find de Malkin's work, including his music videos and the Collision fashion film, on his company's website and in his social media accounts, which I believe are included in the conference notes. So I'm going to hand you over to the artists in a moment. But before I do, I'd like to remind you that you can write any questions for our collaborators in the chat box, and I'll field them after the presentation. I hope you enjoyed this show, and I'll hand over to them now.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here, first of all, and thank you, Katerina, for that beautiful introduction of all of us. As you said, I'm Rachel Corker Brown, and I'm the face behind Corker Brown, and I did my graduate collection from my trauma from my car crashes I had during uni, and I think car crashes are quite common. It's like a big danger factor, I guess, in life if you drive or if you're in a car. So I think it's a shared experience of a lot of people. So when I came to doing my final major project at university, I was like, I want to sort of heal myself through my art, which is fashion. So I decided to like deep dive into that, and initially it wasn't the best thing because it made my PTSD worse, but I ended up going through therapy at the same time, which then made it better. And then I focused less on the car crash itself and more on the aspects around car crashes. So the broken metal, the crashed in doors, the airbags, the seatbelt, car interior, markings on the road, rather than the actual physical act of a crash. And then when I finished uni, I felt that my collection wasn't the best perceived in like just the physical catwalk form. So I was connected with Jonathan, and we really just like mind mapped how Collision was going to be a fashion film, and it was a massive collaborative effort between us initially, and then we brought on a few different like producers and other creatives, including Acti, who's amazing. And yeah, so that's how Collision Fashion Film started. And I'm just gonna share the garments, and then I'm gonna open it up to Acti and Jonathan for us to talk about Collision and how we started and got together. So yeah, if I can open it up to Acti and Jonathan about like how they found Collision and how they had their own creative influences onto it, that would be great.
Who would you like to go first?
I mean, Jonathan came on first, so I was thinking Jonathan, but if his audio is connecting, maybe you.
Jonathan?
Oh, Jonathan, would you like to go first? Because you were the first one I brought on, and we really like worked together to sort of push Collision in the way it went for the fashion film.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Ray. And thank you everyone for having us. Collision was a brilliant turning point, I would say, for my career and creative process, because it was the first project where I really started with why. We started from the ground up with getting to the core of what everything was about, and Collision immediately was about trauma. And we wanted to create a story, not only to inspire, but to really delve deep into what it was like to go through these collisions, these car crashes. I mean, when I first saw the garments, they themselves are quite traumatic. There's tire skid marks going across, there's seatbelts flying about. But Ray and your creativity, you've definitely woven together, no pun intended, something beautiful while also showcasing the true emotions. And working on this, because a fashion film was sort of new territory for me, though I was able to step in as a director because I love working with actors and depicting emotion. What we worked on was we started with considering a cyclical nature. We worked further to talk about, let me gather my thoughts, sorry. What I wanted to do was I wanted to take a piece and showcase what it was like to go through all of this. And I went through an actual experience when I was going through my own traumas, where I was pushing a trolley down the road. I was carrying some things to this train station. And it was at a point in my life where I wanted to just start loving things because anything else wasn't working. And this trolley, I'm sure we all know, when you're in the grocery store, some of them have locked up wheels and they're annoying to push. And then what I learned was just going in with an intention of love truly changed the whole perspective and my whole experience of life. And starting with emotion, we were able to depict, because I don't know contemporary dance, for example, but what I do know is emotion. And we started off with confusion and anger. We're stuck in our own world and nothing makes sense. And it's the anger fueled perpetuation. And what can come out of that is quickly making the decision. And this can take years, this can take lifetimes. But once one starts to love is a choice in the midst of trauma. And this was a big project for me to really apply my why, which is the light is in you. And everything else that comes from that is just an outcome, because that weaves through in everything. Working with Acti was absolutely brilliant because all I was able to do, I just said emotions and we just clicked from there. And that's all it is. The contemporary dance, I don't know the moves, but I do know the emotions. And that is that is its own language. Feeling becomes its own way to communicate. We don't even need spoken word at that point. And it was a great experience. We also did the same for the musical score for it. We actually kept that sort of on the sideline, and as a sort of way to test, a sort of way to see what it would be like. And the first person we communicated with was a drummer, and it was really going through those emotional beats of confusion to anger to perpetuated anger to sort of that snap moment where you're like, hold on, let's take a step back, let's breathe, and let's actually look at what's happening, because it's your life, you're in control of your life, despite what anyone else says and what anyone else lets you think. And the thing with it is we get so stuck in our cycles, and it can be horrible, but you're not alone. And we always have love. I believe that love is the beginning of the answer to everything. I believe that love is the end of the answer to everything. And everything in the middle is what we make it mean. So working on this was fantastic. It took about 10 months, I'd say, start to finish, just about. And we really got to the core of what the trauma was. When you see the film, you will see how dark it can get, because there's the surrounding. It's like, you're clouded by your own internal feelings and fears and thoughts and anxieties. And what can come out of that is also, we also have the power to love. So yeah, I think that's about it.
So with trauma, I think I found that there's like these, not maybe just two paths, but you can either really like pull yourself into it and be like so down about it and so like self-deprecating about it, or like with a lot of trauma and a lot of situations that are really relevant past, present, and will be in future, you have to really push yourself to the light side of it, and the like not making something of it, but just not getting down in it. Same with like mental health. It's really important to like push up, and it's really hard to do it with PTSD and other things, but I think doing this film and putting it into my art really helped me, and I think Acti really helped show the emotions, and that's why I wanted it to be a dance fashion film, to show the emotions, to and the film itself to show how hard it is and how trapping it is, and to have that release at the end, because it does get a lot better. But yeah, Acti, if you want to talk about some of the things we collaborated on.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about this project, and thank you, Jonathan. From my point of view, I would like to say that dance is an intimate experience. It's a feeling that the body goes through physically and emotionally that is so specific to each of us, and it carries a million different meanings. It's always the hardest for me to explain and articulate when people ask me why I dance or what dance means to me. And I would say it's the exact same thing when people ask why you create dance, choreography, or movement. It's unique to each of us in all possible ways. Likewise, trauma is an experience, a very intimate one. In a way, trauma can be physical or psychological, but in the end, the two collide as one, as we all live in a body that can't be separated from the idea of the psyche. And that realization let me collide dance and trauma as a bizarre metaphorical connection, basically, for this project. So when Ray and Jonathan asked me to choreograph for Collision, it all happened, I would say, quite naturally. Even though I personally haven't experienced the car crash, my body carries so much weight and, in a way, physically and mentally, so much weight through dance that I could very clearly understand what this project was about, in a way, translating the experience into physical and visual performance. The way I choreographed the piece was based on improvisation with a very clear physical and creative direction. We spent time physicalizing the specifics of trauma as a meaning, and quite frankly, the car crash itself. so we can create the dance out of this. We ended up with a quite specific structure, I would say. And the body language was gradually shaped by me and the dancers in collaboration, with loads of exploration around the meanings that we already talked about. If I have to talk about me as a choreographer, I'm not interested in dance for the sake of dance. So my process is usually almost autobiographical, as everything I create is based on mine and my dancer's perception of what it is we're doing really, and how it resonates with us on a human level. It would be very difficult to explain exactly how it looks like. So I would say, I hope we can all see the video.
Yeah, I think that's a good segment to go into seeing Collision, the fashion film. I will share it now. 2 seconds. So yeah, that was Collision, the fashion film, and I think we maybe didn't talk about the significance of the trolley almost being in your mind and being trapped, and having like people like grab at you and it being really disorientating, and yeah, and then how free Cassie the dancer was at the end when she like finally realizes she's in control of the trolley. The trolley can't actually keep her inside the trolley mind, basically. Jonathan?
Yes, I think I was looking back on our notes, and one of the words we used was tormentors, and I think it's quite a good word, because that's how it can feel when you're. I think a lot of the time we feel very alone when things happen, and a lot of us, while traumas can be similar, it's what we make it mean to us specifically because of all of our past and everything we've learned that makes it unique to us, and that's sort of how it can lead to us thinking we're alone. But the reality is, I think human beings at our core are kind, and we are not alone, and we can hold on so strongly to these traumas. And yeah, again, I think when we realize and when we live a life with love, it's all about love, I say. Like that's the outcome, you know. We can be stuck in our pits for however long, but there is always a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that Collision showcased that brilliantly. And it was amazing working with this crew because everyone got the why. I think on set, we were really all feeling the true emotions of how horrible it was and how it's tight. It's you can't escape. You are trapped. And I think the dancers portrayed that spot on, better than I could have ever imagined it actually happening. And that's really the beauty of the creative process I love. Because when you start with why, the how and the what can be that clear. And again, with the music, the same thing. We briefed everyone creatively on it all. And obviously the three of us were the most involved in the process. And I think I'm very happy with the product. And I think it's going to be something that we go back to show that it's a way of depicting trauma with a happy ending, as it were.
Yeah. So from the start of when I did my initial research, I was researching a lot into, which probably was a bit detrimental to me initially, where I was researching a lot into the actual crashes, and my research was a bit not put in the right direction. And then I came away from it and did the silhouettes, what the silhouettes meant to me. Like the pink dress is paneled, so it's not like side and back and sleeves. It's like, I think it's got maybe 12 different panelings on it, like different pattern pieces for the garment, because when I put them all together, I shifted them to do the print of the tire, and then I sewed them straight, so it was all mismatched and like cut up and messed up and sewn back together into this beautiful garment. And I didn't just want to have, all the metallic of cars and black of roads, and I wanted that splash of pink, that splash of passion, and the splash of also the connotation for pink could be like some femininity in it, as well as this like delicateness. So that was the pink dress, and I just liked how it wasn't tight and it was oversized, and I had a lot of big silhouettes and also some thinner silhouettes in it. And I don't know if you saw the airbag dress in the first video and the collision video, which is a corseted dress underneath, quite structured, but it's quite structured because it has to hold such a heavy weight of, I think it was 5 airbags. I draped and hand sewed with seatbelt straps on the dress. And I wanted that to be this big, almost comme des garçons style, like just out there garment. And I did then an airbag jacket. I did trousers that were gathered in places, which would represent like smashed doors and the crinkledness of like broken cars. And then that was black but had a tint of rainbow in it to look like oil spill, which you do get a lot in car crashes when something smashed into something which has water or liquid or oil in, and then there's like a leak on the road. And you also, I think, I see now when I'm walking and I see like an oil spill, it always like gives me a smile. It reminds me of my collection and the collision days. And I think it's just beautiful, even though it is like pollution. I do think just the rainbow and the black is beautiful. And yeah, with my silhouettes, I just tried to like push in places where like a car door would be dented from another car, and then out in other places because cars are quite boxy. And yeah, I just don't think everything should be like thin to the body, tight now that it is the trend at the moment. And I like the, playing with like tight spaces and bigger spaces on garments, I think is really cool, and making it sculptural as well. And yeah, maybe we should look at the BTS, which would explain a bit more, and then we can talk again afterwards. So I'll share my screen again.
The inspiration behind my collection came from 2 car crashes I had during my first year of uni, resulting in trauma. I channeled the pain from this into my collection, and throughout I found I was fascinated by odd and broken things that other people didn't find as beautiful, the perfectly imperfect.
So at the core, collision is about trauma, it's about chaos, and it's about coming out of an anger and stressful situation and spinning it around and looking inwards, making positivity out of negativity.
I was really intrigued by Ray's car crash aesthetic. I thought it was very provocative. You have this driver who is pent up with rage and frustration and to some degree mistrust. until it's euphoric release from her body that helps her realize she is actually quite free. The difference between producing a short fashion film and a short narrative, I found fashion films have to be more concise, more deliberate, they're so visually focused, versus a short narrative. You've got the emotional engagement and quality of storytelling there.
Your attitude is perpetuating that reflection back at you. So channel that anger, build up to it, and then realize that you were in control the whole time.
When Ray approached me for Collision, I was excited to jump on the chance to tell a complex array of emotions about trauma, PTSD, and turning it into something beautiful to hopefully inspire an audience.
The motivation to turn my collection into a fashion film came from the feelings and trauma being alive and couldn't be portrayed in stagnant garments. The garments needed movement, and dance was a great way to show the emotion behind Collision.
Directing contemporary dance was a lot of fun because while I had not done it in that depth before, bringing on a choreographer, we were able to work together on the vision, and what was delivered was completely beyond what I would have expected. A big theme in Collision is trust, and when we were looking for crew members, that's something that we also wanted to apply, working with passionate people who put love and went beyond the brief. And every single person who worked on it was absolutely brilliant at all those jobs, and the whole piece came together and it wouldn't have been the same without anyone.
So yeah, that was the BTS for Collision, and you saw a lot of the crew and you saw more of the behind the scenes, which it was shot in a scrapyard near my hometown, which I actually sourced a lot of the materials I used in my final collection. So this really nice guy who owned it, I just went and I was like, hey, I'm doing this art project, and can I have these airbags, and can I have these seat belts, and can I have this random seat? And one of the things I made was a clutch bag out of a visor as well. And then I went back to him a few months later and I was like, hey, can I shoot in your scrapyard at night? And then, yeah, so it was really cool to shoot in the scrapyard. And I think with the, like, they had rows and rows of cars, and having all the cars like sort of enclosing on everyone was also really good for the aesthetic of the film and the representation it also had. And you saw as well there, we had our producer Ryan, and he was amazing, and he was a massive help doing, like, getting everything going. We really couldn't have done it without him either.
Yeah, going to the locations, I definitely think we got some brilliant spots. Like, talking about the tunneling of all of those cars, that definitely can be representative of, like, the void, you know? And we chose to do a night shoot for that because that's like the sort of darker thing with the tormentors, and we lit it very top down from a creative process to really, like, you have sort of brighter spots that, and it's just a very high contrast scene because it's supposed to be a bit dreamy in that sense. And then obviously the juxtaposition with the beautiful location quite nearby of the daytime, where we do go into the happier, but it's not immediately happy, but it is just Cassie, the solo dancer. And that's where we really combine the visceral with the more lighter aspects.
Yeah, from start to finish in the fashion film, I think you can really see her struggle at the beginning and the struggle she's having with the trolley. Cut to the scrapyard where she's being thrown in, it's all around her, she can't escape, and to the ending where she's still struggling, but it's getting better and she feels more free and she feels happier. And it was really like a representation I felt of my collection, and also me personally through my final year of uni, my PTSD, going through therapy, and then also channeling my trauma into this art, as well as I did drawings, I did made garments, I made sketchbooks about it, and then I also made a fashion film, and I still make clothing today slightly inspired by it. I tend to move away from it now because I feel like I've done it, and it was a massive part of me, and I felt almost my identity for a while. And I'm still wearing some clothes which have tire prints on and like cut up bits that are, I feel a bit raw. But I'm definitely, in my design style now is more colorful and like happier, because that's how I am as a person now. And that's, I think, with designers and with directors and with choreographers is the same. You kind of, what's going on around you at the time, you do challenge your work a bit, which I think is beautiful as a creative to do. But yeah, I really felt that Ryan, the producer, Jonathan, director, Acti, the choreographer, and all the dancers and people who helped out really did get it, and they really put that all into it to make it what it was, and I'm very grateful for everything they did, and it was really good. So it was almost 2.5 years ago we shot this, so you can see all of us looking slightly different in the BTS videos, and Jonathan was the really long hair.
Yeah, it was fun looking back on the long hair. Yeah. I think it's been a great turning point, because that was really the first project where I started with why, and I wanted to get into your head, Ray. I wanted to know everything that was going on to be able to depict it. You don't, as a writer, you can't, they say, I agree with it, is you can't really write about things you don't know, you haven't experienced. And we can, while I haven't been in the specific traumas of those car collisions, I can relate and pull from my own experiences of that. And the more communication we had, I'm taking all of that and still viewing collision as like a sort of staple of how to approach anything else from a project management standpoint, because once you know why, everything else just goes.
Yeah, I think I got asked a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sure. So one of the questions, a great one from Lucy, is she's asking, Rachel, can you tell us more about how it's still inspiring your fashion design now? And it's really interesting to see how you're still wearing the tire prints. I mean, we can almost see you from like the shoulders up. Do you see it almost as a form of armor or protection? Or
I think fashion can be an armor and protection, because people use it to express themselves, and it's been like that throughout history. When people can get it, they use it to express themselves. And I think if you, especially in London, you see people express themselves through their hair. Like I used to have blue, pink, purple, whatever hair to express myself, and then through their clothing, through their shoes, through their makeup. I do base my fashion on my life, basically, and I think through happier times I have more color in my fashion, and I'm doing like more pinks and purples for like love and inspiration and happiness, and also like blues for like tranquility. But yeah, so I still have that thing, I think, from collision, where I want to do big silhouettes, I want things oversized, but then I want them pinched in here, I want a bit of gather here. And I think with every designer, from your initial like big thing that you really liked doing and you really liked your finished product, you carry a bit of that style like forever, I think, through your designs.
Wow, that's really interesting. We also have Lucy was talking as well about how she thought the idea of the corset carrying the weight of trauma is really interesting as well, because it's interesting how you have different things, because you have different attitudes to the body with the more loose clothing, but then the more fitted could be some way of kind of holding you in. I mean, something that I noticed in the video was the motif of the circle. So I noticed it, and there was a circle skirt, the circular motion of the trolley, and even in the choreography. Is that some to do with repetition, or is it?
I think circles are repetition in fashion and film and dance, wherever, as well as lines. Like you can't really escape shapes in this sort of art industry. With the circle, it had a pleated circle that when you span, obviously the pleats like expanded, and then between the pleats, so when it was flat, it was like a straight like a tire print line, and then when the pleats expanded, it broke up, and that to me was representing like the breakup of the trauma. and also like the breakup of like pattern matching as well. So yeah, I think everything had a slight representation. Most of it was intentional. Even if it wasn't intentional, I think your subconscious like will still do it, as I think the same with directing and choreography. Your subconscious will still push you to do things that are in line with what you originally wanted.
That's great. And we have another question from Rebecca. This is for Acti. Please, could you comment on how the dancers related to the clothes?
Of course. So we decided to put the clothes like depending on how the dancers were moving. And actually in dance, I have to say that it's actually really, really, really important how you feel in what you wear. And this changes the way you move a lot. So I truly believe that every one of them had a slightly different approach to how they were moving in terms of what they were wearing. Some of them had like, you know, the biggest and puffier and like a lot more structured clothes. And some of them actually had like the more fitted clothes. And I can say that for sure, from my experience as a performer, when you have like bigger stuff, you like your movement also expands a lot more. And the fitted clothes kind of like lure you in being more technical and more restricted. So I'm assuming, I haven't asked them like personally, but what I saw as a choreographer was like each of them had a slightly different approach and movement depending on what they were wearing also.
Great. And now we have a question about the music from Lucy. She was saying it's very effective in helping to drive the emotions along with a fantastic choreography. How did you pick the music? And
yeah, yeah, thank you for that. I'm a big fan of the music as well. We started from the ground up and we started with the same emotional beats. So this is a fun fact. The musical score and the fashion film itself, video footage, never met until the end, and we put it together. So we were now obviously there were time code stamped. So the drummers and the guitarist knew what was going on, but I worked very hands-on with a local drummer and a guitarist. We had a bassist and quite an in-depth sound team. And all they got was notes on the emotions. And all I did was go back and forth with saying, I either feel it or I don't. And the drums really set the tone for all of it. Like I think I used the word psychedelic many times and cyclical many times. And you get that with it goes so chaotic. And then that relief, we were referencing Pink Floyd, Roger Waters, and a bit of Jeff Beck for the guitar at the end. And what we came up with was absolutely beautiful. But yeah, they were separate up until the end. And I think that was a bit of an exercise to see how well emotion can translate.
Oh, I think that separation completely worked, because obviously when you're in a car accident, you're not in control. And the music seemed to really just bring that home. Like it was almost moving a bit faster maybe than the dancers. I mean, Acti, could you talk about the time? Did you have the dancers moving to the music in time, or was there a slight separation?
So as a choreographer, I almost never, because never say never, but almost never work on the music as like, in a sense that, you know, dancers are going to be in a specific rhythm. But mostly I'm trying to find the rhythm that I went through the movement and then put it on the music. So I basically worked through the emotion and the improvisation during the rehearsals. I had a whole playlist of like things that I thought they were representing the emotion and the visual that we wanted to achieve. And I never asked them to be on the music in a sense that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever like that. I mostly wanted to see what they can come up with individually and like in their own way of translating the emotion and whatever music is for them. So I didn't know what the music was going to be until actually I saw the film. But I feel like for me as a choreographer, what I'm supposed to be creating is something that could work in anything that goes around the original idea.
Well, thank you all so much. We just hit upon lunchtime now, so I think I'll hand back over and take a break.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So much.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome everyone, my name is Connie and it gives me huge pleasure to welcome you to the second of these this afternoon sessions for the conference. Unfortunately, the original programme discussing how school rules reinforce marginalisation, cultural erosion and hierarchies with regards to standards of beauty and aesthetics with Mutiti has had to be cancelled at the very last minute. But we do have three amazing women who are joining us and agreed to jump in at the last minute to discuss beauty and inclusion. The three amazing women who are going to join us now for the discussion on beauty and inclusion is Mina Bagela, and she is a makeup pro who's been in the industry for over 10 years, whilst also teaching makeup at LCF. She's passionate about race inclusion in her profession and teaching practice, for example, piloting a project to steer changes that are needed to embed race inclusion within hair and makeup courses. Her interest in social justice and race inclusion inspired her to launch 4,000 Miles, which documents British Asian girls in creative spaces. She engages in futuristic approaches and piloted the Beauty Down Low, a platform that initiates support structures to makeup artists transitioning from higher education to the world of freelance. We also have Diana Donaldson, and she has maintained a role in education as course leader and senior lecturer alongside her professional industry practice for over 20 years. Diana's all-inclusive and tenacious approach is exemplified through her work and experience in providing specialist style services to a diverse esoteric client base and through her extensive work as a creative producer with high-profile clients and global brands working in allied disciplines for the creative industries in the UK, Europe, United States, and Asia. She's an ardent supporter and is active in producing projects for the charitable, medical, and higher education sector. And her specialist areas of interest in academia are social justice, inclusive pedagogy, I'm sorry, I can't say that word properly, diverse, innovative curriculum development, and defining complex student cohort dynamics. She's committed and a prolific mentor, having trained exhaustively in the academic world for over 15 years. And as she says in her own words, my work and identity reflect a passion for curious and courageous creativity. And lastly, we have Paula Goodwin, who is a seasoned practitioner with over 30 years experience in expert cutting and styling of men's and women's hair and has won a number of awards for her work. She demonstrates classic and modern cuts, shaves, hair tattooing and pictorial designs, and has been an integral part of major media events in fashion, TV and more, whilst also working at Salon International and Afro hair and beauty exhibitions for over 2 decades. She's also been integral in developing the award body of City and Guilds, their diverse and detailed curriculum, a curriculum specification consultant. She's enabled the delivery of hairdressing and barbering units for levels 1, 2 and 3, and edited textbooks and exam papers for colleges internationally. She has also established a highly successful barbering course in a Category B prison, rehabilitating men aged 18 to 60. Through constructive conversations, she's built a cohesive classroom environment, including with gang members, using barbering as a way of embracing a different and progressive way of positive change. Currently, 25 men have gone on to work in salons upon release, 4 have enrolled in colleges to study hairdressing further, and 5 have established their own barbers' shops. So I think we can agree that we have 3 wonderful people to talk to us this afternoon. We're going to start with a short film. It's a 10-minute film by Emma Dabiri called Black Hair is Still Stigmatized. And once that has finished, then we will be joined by Paula, Mina, and Diana. And please do ask questions at any time.
My name's Emma Dabbery and I am a broadcaster and author of Don't Touch My Hair. Thanks. There are a number of reasons why the history and the contemporary reality of Afro hair is so important, but one of those really stems from the stigma that exists around our hair and where that stigma comes from. For Africans in Africa, before slavery, before colonialism, there would have been, and there was, no stigma attached to having Afro-textured hair, to having Afro hair. There was no concept of good hair being a type of hair that more closely resembles European hair. This idea of there being a stigma related to it emerges directly from the transatlantic slave trade and the dehumanization of Africans that was necessary to justify their wide-scale enslavement. And part of that dehumanization process was to say that African people and people of African descent were not fully human. And one of the ways in which that was done was through our hair, which it was claimed was not actually hair. So it was European people that had hair and African people had wool. And of course that association with the characteristics of an animal, with livestock, goes a long way in justifying the exploitation of people in that way. Look, these aren't they're not really people. They actually have characteristics more in common with livestock. They can be used on our farms, on our plantations. So that negativity around our hair really stems from that history, and that was maintained throughout Black people's experiences in America and in the Caribbean and in the diaspora, and those attitudes were also introduced to the continent through colonialism and through the global media and European beauty standards, which always presented Black features and particularly our hair as not only other but as far, far lesser. These are not issues that belong to some far-flung, distant history, but they are ideas that are still extremely potent today. It's only as recently as from kind of 2010, 2011 that you start to see Black women rejecting this imposed beauty standard and rediscovering the beauty of our natural hair. And it's only very recently that that is becoming normalized again, which brings us to today, whereby sales of hair relaxers, the products that are used to chemically straighten Afro hair, have slumped dramatically and have gone from being one of the best-selling products in the multi-billion Afro hair industry to being by far one of the smallest segments now. That's really, really positive. But what we've seen happen kind of in parallel with that is this backlash against our hair. And particularly in schools, we've seen a huge rise in punishments, regulatory policies and procedures, and school exclusions for Black children, mixed children, children of African descent, whose natural hair is deemed unsuitable for the school environment. Amongst these school petitions, one of the hairstyles that comes up again and again as problematic are shaved styles. In the Black community, it's entirely normal for boys and men to have tightly shorn and barbered hair. These tightly shorn hairstyles keep daily maintenance to more of a minimum, but also conform to norms in Black culture about tidiness and presentability. A case that was in the media last year, one of many, involved a 5-year-old boy who was excluded from school because the school deemed his hair too short. He was not allowed to return to school until his hair grew back and covered his scalp. However, the way his hair was cut is the way that my son wears his hair, is the way that many Black and mixed race boys wear their hair. Not only have we not seen a decline in these cases, but they seem to be on the increase. The news is full of cases of Black and mixed children who've been excluded from school for doing nothing more than daring to wear their hair as it grows from their heads, or in using the protective styles that are necessary for the maintenance and health of our hair. In 2019, World Afro Day commissioned a report to examine this area more fully. And it found that anti-Afro hair policies had risen by over 66%. If you kind of flip the script and reverse everything, imagine my hair was the norm and the school policy reflected that norm. Everybody who went to the school was told that they had to make their hair resemble mine, even if that was virtually impossible to do and could only be achieved by painful and dangerous chemical procedures. I don't want to know about that. I don't care how you do it, but you just need to do it. This is the school policy. This is the norm. You have to make your hair look like an afro. That would be absolutely ludicrous. But effectively, that is what Black children are being told when they are being forced to make their hair conform to standards that have emerged to suit the characteristics of European hair. It's been really wonderful for me to see all of the conversations that Don't Touch My Hair has started, all of the different types of people who have gotten in touch with me, just saying that it's really changed their understanding of lots of different issues, and hearing that there are schools that have changed their uniform policy from reading the book and coming to realize that policy around hair in particular was disproportionately negatively impacting on Black and mixed pupils. So really, I just hope, I hope there's more of that, and that the very necessary change that needs to happen is forthcoming.
Okay, so I think that was a fabulous little insight into the beginning to allow this conversation to continue now with Diana and Paula and Mina. So Mina, do you want to kick off with your following thoughts from watching that film?
Yeah, I think a lot of conversations that we have at the university with students is about, is a white person allowed to have braids? Can a white person have cornrows? And there's always this conversation around cultural appropriation. But I think that video kind of summarizes everything, that it's actually not about white people having their hair braided. It's actually about those who belong to that culture are not able to have or wear their cultural wears that are true to their culture. And then therefore they're being penalized for it. And I think people kind of like focus too much about what white people are doing, but not focusing on, you know, there's an issue here with the people who belong to that culture and they're being penalized for what is natural to them. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Diana, do you want to take over?
Yeah, I mean, it's, for me, well, first of all, hello everyone, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. You know, if we go straight off of the back of what we've just seen here, that has a specific focus on hair, although we're going to be talking about beauty and inclusivity. You know, one of the points that Mina made about discussions about who can wear what is around the idea of appropriation. And that is a bit of a difficult one, because on the one hand, if you are really truly embracing the idea of diversity and inclusion, then you will understand that appropriation can mean many different things. And I think it has to be acknowledged that the merging of many different cultures not only has happened throughout time, historically, forever. You know, it's gaining momentum. We have the, you know, social media, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think what's really important here is to remember to do that respectfully, to do that authentically, and to do that compassionately and with knowledge. So you have, where it becomes offensive is where these attributes are not given credit or understood in the context, in their original context. So if I use an example, this is something that I was thinking about the other day. There's an artist that some might know, Little Nas, who did a country and western song called Old Town Road, and it was Billboard's of Billboard's Hot 100 longest running you know, tracks. It was voted number one for the longest time, and now there's a kind of, you know, dialogue and discussions around, is it actually country and western because it's from Little Nas? So, you know, but if you look at the heart of country and western, that has so many different influences. You have blues, you have bluegrass music, you have Scottish folk music, you have Irish folk music. It doesn't originate from one place, but then all of a sudden, Little Nas is held out, and, you know, it's being queried. His achievement here in this area is being highlighted and interrogated, if you like. That's where it doesn't quite add up and doesn't quite work.
Yeah, Paula, where coming from an educational point of view, where is your where are you looking to direct this now?
Well, for me, I find that from the standpoint when I was a child going to school, I went to a school in Muswell Hill, and I was the only Black child in my year. So there was never an understanding of why my mother made me wear my hair the way I did, as in braids or cornrows, whereas all my peers had, you know, just flowing hair that was just held in ponytails, and it was easy to maintain. And then looking at that 40 years later, we still have the same issues in schools, where a lot of young girls, their mums braid their hair because it's easy for them to maintain. It makes it easier for them to take care of first thing in the morning, and they spend hours at the salon to get their hair done, pay a lot of money, go to school with their new braids, and then they get told, oh, you can't come to school because your hair is not suitable. And a lot of teachers or heads of schools are not aware of the complexity of Afro hair and the need for it to be, you know, braided in the way that it's braided. And even like Diana said, for the young Black boys to have their hair shaved as well. It just makes it easier. And it's a form of expression as well. And it's a traditional thing that a lot of Black families have done for generations throughout the years.
So what we're doing is we're through your work commercially, all of you, you're being able to put to bring us sort of bring it to the forefront of being able to be much more inclusive and diverse at the same time. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I like to think there's an effort, there's a long way to go. I mean, the curious thing about the beauty industry, the multi-billion-pound beauty industry, you know, Black hair and makeup is astronomical. There's an astronomical amount of money that goes into Black hair and makeup commercially. There are so few Black-owned industries So on the one hand, it's acknowledged because commercially it's more than viable. On the other hand, you're only beginning to see, or there's only recently been that access for Black-owned businesses to do their thing and to promote their product. And this is largely down to the online forum, the internet, the social media, which is great. And I think for me personally, in terms of what I do, I have tried always to maintain a link in education as well as industry. It's really important for me to be in industry because I'm working with the talent of tomorrow, and they hopefully will be in a position, if they come across people like me, to really think and consider what inclusivity is through my practice and my work with them, and then take that into industry.
Mina, is that, do you have, I'm presuming you have exactly the same approach?
Yeah, as Diana was talking, I was thinking about my first experience in on a hair and makeup course. This was like in the early 2000s, but our session, I remember it so clearly, on how to approach color theory on deeper skin tones was to get a white piece of paper and get some deep foundations and do swatch tests on pieces of paper. And even back then I thought, well, firstly, a piece of white paper is nobody's skin tone, like nobody has that color skin. Secondly, you have like the material that is not even skin in the first place. And all I'm doing is coloring brown bits of paint on a white bit of paper, expecting to learn about how to work on Black and Asian skin tones. And the simple solution could have been just to get some models in so we can see like an actual demonstration. And I wonder now, like, what are they considering in terms of inclusion on the course? Like, I haven't had a conversation with the tutor. I would love to have a conversation with her because I did a project about race inclusion in hair and makeup, and I wanted to include her for an interview, but there wasn't time. But I'm going to do that at a later date. But I'm just interested to know, like, how have they evolved from the white pieces of paper and doing swatches of foundation?
So Paula, you've been teaching for many years, haven't you?
Many years, yeah.
How can you answer that in terms of Mina and how it's approached now in class?
I find that with the aspect, because most of my teaching at the moment has been in barbering, working with men, and I lead all the teaching curriculums in the prison. I find that with barbershops, there's a lot of stigma and stereotypes in each barbershop. So like you get your typical Turkish barbershop that only does Turkish European clients. Then you've got your English barbers, and then you've got your Black barbers. And you don't find many of them catering for each type of hair. So when I teach them, I purposely make different ethnic groups work on each other as a way of introducing each hair type to them. I start on the basis of the theory side, the hair textures and the types, and I get each person to pair up with a different race, and then each to feel and touch and familiarize with each other's hair, and then they practice on each other how to do the haircut, and to realize that the same techniques that they use, whether it's Asian, Turkish, or English, or Black barbershop, it's the same technique to achieve the same looks. The only difference is the texture of the hair. So I find that working in that way, I've broken a lot of stereotypes within the male industry. And I mean, especially working in a prison. So, I mean, you've got more than enough models to work on, and it makes it, and people are more confident at approaching another type of hair other than their own, and they don't find it as intimidating or daunting. And I find as well that a lot of the European students actually appreciate the diversity of Afro hair, and realizing that Afro has about 38 different textures, not just limited to the, the standard 6 that we get in the textbooks. So for me, yeah, it's working. I find it's working well, and I hope that something like this is introduced in women's hairdressing as well.
Yeah. I think that's what it's about. It's about dismantling that fear and not being afraid to approach skin and approach hair. And one of the sessions that we piloted in terms of like skin tones, we got a round of models with deep skin tones to medium skin tones to the lighter skin tones. And what we did in the sessions, I got the students to pair up, and they all have a model each. And I spun the room around at least 3 times, so they all got to work on a different skin tone. And then in the afternoon, they got to create a nude look that worked with that skin tone. So they're looking at skin about 4 times in one day. And we ran this session for the first time last year, and students still message me till this day and say that one session, just one session, has transformed how they approach skin. It's transformed like their confidence. They don't feel afraid to approach deeper skin tones. And if we can manage to do that in one lesson, like what can they do if we provide more and more and more? So sort of like isolating these sessions and making them one-off, we're looking at how we can embed inclusion into the current technical delivery so they sit side by side of what already exists.
And Diana, when you're working with clients, and I presume you get like storyboards for whether you're working on a commercial or whatever, are you in the driving seat in terms of who you can use, and or is it do you find it's very much white based initially, and then you have to sort of direct?
Yeah, no, it varies. When I started out, I would be the only person of color, the only Black female, the only Black anyone in a space. And depending on the job, I mean, sometimes, especially if you have celebrity clients or otherwise, you're walking into that space and having to deliver, but even then you can meet reluctance. I've had people, because I'm up close and personal, that don't want you near them, and they have been very explicit in saying that. Luckily for me, at those times that it's happened and it's been at its worst, I've had a really supportive production team behind me that have pretty much gone in and said, whoever you are, this is our person.
Yeah.
So if you don't like it, go. But it's all these experiences that I bring to the fore in education. That's why it's such a beautiful relationship, if you like. I can pass on these experiences and say, here's how to handle it. Here's how to handle it when you have that backing and when you don't as well, because that can make you feel a sense of rejection and many other things. But I think it's important to understand, who you are and where you stand in the world. That's just as important. And I understand that there is fear. We're talking about, diversity and inclusion. And I'm not just speaking, if we talk, look at EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, that is not just, somebody's pigment. It's not just about that. It is being, to me, it is being all inclusive. So there are ways that you adapt. And I think one of the things that I've come across multiple times, I think there's a fear that some people have of maybe getting it wrong, or it might seem too complex, in their approach. I don't have that, because I grew up, although I grew up in a predominantly, just, as Paula said, I went to a predominantly white school, as was very typical back at the time. Paula, you had, you were the only person in your year. I was one of 3 in my year. I thought that was bad, but you trumped me on that. And, whilst the other students might not have learned about us, we certainly learned about them, and definitely in the neighborhoods that we were growing up in. I could do one of the first hair jobs that I was called to do, not being trained in hair, but having a mother who was a nurse and also did hair, as many of our parents did, multiple things. Because I've got to say, at the time, there were no, hair salons for, parents of my generation to go to. So they all kind of, worked from home and were mobile until they established themselves. And I learned from my mother. And one of the first jobs that I had, where I was called in because the hairstylist walked out, the makeup artist walked out as well. I was doing the styling. I did all of it, the makeup and the hair, was an albino Asian girl. So her hair was dead straight, and I was able to, she had a fringe and they wanted it slicked back, which was a problem for other trained hairstylists. But, with some of the products and creativity within the world of Black hairstyling, I was able to do that relatively easily. But I think, people shouldn't be afraid to try. And once you have dialogues and events like this, it makes it easier to broach and to discuss. I think that's key. It shouldn't be an inhibitor. It shouldn't stop people from trying.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about also an event like this, I'm guessing you guys will come from London, into London schools, but I'm thinking about, in the rest of the country, and where there still is today, maybe just one Black child in a class. And we're going back to this whole thing of school, how events like today of opening up the discussion, not being afraid to talk about it, and then of course social media is so important to allow the children who aren't in a very multicultural society, that in a big city, to be able to see that there's so much diversity out there, and it's okay to be there.
It's very important. I did a project as part of UAL have a research project and called Knowledge Exchange. So it's community-based research and giving back, if you like. And I did a project recently in March with a school in East London, and girls' school. I wanted to work with year 10 because my research up until that point had shown me that is quite a crucial age in terms of self-identity, just that criticality of who am I, where am I, what's my place in this world. And this barrage of social media as well makes an interesting mix. And I was surprised by some of the feedback. I did this presentation to 180 students, and some of the feedback that I'm still working through really surprised me. I had, as part of the presentation, a short film with some young people, their peers, sort of 5 years or so, a bit older than them, discussing some of the similar issues and topics that I was covering. And I was quite surprised to see in the feedback how many young women were speaking about wearing their natural hair and feeling a bit more confident to try. And actually, I would have thought it was a given at that age. that we're seeing so much more acceptance, that it was a given, and it's not. It was really wonderful to read that, and makes me want to do more, but it was quite insightful to see that they still have these, you know, whether it's them, you know, it doesn't just come from them, it's obviously societal, it could be within the educational system as well. But I'll look into why this is, but that they were willing to try to embrace their curly hair. They were quoting someone that they had seen in the film. I found that quite encouraging as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Paula, what do you have to add to that with regards to particularly the men in the prisons that you work with? Paula? Oh, I think we've lost her. I think maybe she's muted herself. Mina, do you want to add to that?
Oh, I think she's back.
Oh,
yeah, sorry, yeah, sorry. I find that with the men, the most challenging aspect with them is actually teaching them how to braid. A lot of men would say to me, miss, my fingers are too thick. I can't do that. I'm just like, your fingers are not too thick, yeah? We just got to make your fingers bend. So it was, for me, it was a nice achievement to see like Eastern European men learning to braid hair on the mannequin and doing an amazing job of it, and then being able to take that same technique they just mastered and do it on an afro hair texture and do the braid to an impressive standard. And even for them, they were quite shocked. They were like, oh my gosh, if I could take a picture of what I've done and send it to my mum would cry. And I'm like, really? They're like, yeah, because I would never touch my mum's hair or brush my sister's hair when I was at home. But now I'm in prison, I've actually learned how to braid hair, and they've learned how to do extensions. And I think as well, it's just down to the way you break it down to them and introduce the concept to them. I found that the guys really engaged very well with it, and they were eager to learn more. And so the first thing I would teach them was how to do like a 2-strand twist, a basic braid. Then I'd teach them the 3-strand, then I'd teach them the cane row. And some of the guys got on so well, I actually taught them how to do extensions in the hair, in the cornrows, and how to do garner braids, more complex plaiting techniques. And I mean, in the men's prison, there's a lot of guys with long hair. So these ones that have this plaiting ability now, they've become, you might as well say, the connoisseurs of their wing where they are, because everybody now wants them to braid their hair to help maintain it. And even like teaching, there's one Asian guy I taught from Bangladesh, I taught him how to take care of locks and how to do interlocking. So all the guys on the wing with dreads come to this Bangladeshi guy to get their dreads done. And, you know, I think it's just down to the way teachers introduce new topics to the learners and take away all those misconceptions and prejudices that society has developed along the way. And I find that the guys work happily together, and they actually teach each other as well. When they see a fellow student doing something wrong, they're like, oh, no. Miss said that we must do it like this. Let's take it back and take it back to this stage. This is where it went wrong, and we'll take it from there. And, you know, watching them doing this is amazing. It's so amazing. Whereas in another natural environment, these guys would not learn these skills.
Well, I think what's very clear is that it has always been the same, but even more important now is it's education, isn't it? And all three of you are just, you know, you're great standard bearers for really bringing this to the fore, for the young to have the confidence. Yes. And with the men, Paula, I'm interested because you're teaching or working with men from I think it's 18 to 60. Do you find that the younger ones are more open to the availability of your teaching, or does it is everyone? Does it matter? Does age have a consequence on their
I find a lot of the young men are open. The younger guys, anyone say under 30, anything I want to show them, they run to it, they gravitate to it instantly. Some of the older generations, you'll find like they'll come up with things like, where's the man teacher? I'm like, I am the teacher. Because yeah, but you're a woman. Oh, sorry. Oh, the screen's gone funny. I'll just keep talking. But you're a woman. I'm just like, yes, I'm a woman. I know my trade and I'm here to train you guys. I don't want a woman training me. So I've had those reactions from older men, from certain ethnicities. But on the whole, to learn once they get past those barriers. My video went.
Yeah, no, your sound is slightly going as well. Unfortunately, we haven't got long left. I just want to see if there are any questions. My chat isn't working for some reason. I'm wondering if, we've had Lucy's saying this is such a stimulating and much needed conversation. Thank you. How do you think hair, makeup, beauty can express or even affect our identity or how we feel?
I was going to chime in with what Diana and Paula were saying, and it was making me think about beauty ideals. And when there's a session that I run called contouring, and I don't deliver it in the true sense of beauty contouring. I kind of get them to kind of break down the flesh and the skull, and we kind of do a reverse contour. But during the conversation, I asked the students, like, do you contour? And if you do, what parts of the face do you contour? And most will say, you know, I want higher cheekbones, or I want a slimmer nose, or, you know, I want to make my eyes wider. And I get them to sort of break down and to understand why, like, why do you do that? Why do you want to have, you know, high cheekbones or slimmer nose? And most often I would find that the students would say things like, I'm not sure. I don't know why. I just sort of copied what someone did on YouTube because it was part of the steps. So I'm like, okay, so if you don't really know why you're doing it, then why are you doing it? Because if we want to use slimming down the nose as an example, which is something that I use, is that if you're indirectly saying that slimmer noses are more desirable, more beautiful than a wider nose, and then it trickles down into race, that those who have a wider nose in particular racial groups compared to those who don't, you are saying that this group over here is more desirable, more beautiful than the other group. And when I present it in that way, everyone goes really quiet, and they start to feel embarrassed about why they're sort of doing the things that they're doing. It's not for me to say, you know, what is a beauty ideal, you know, this is the most beautiful thing, or this is the most ideal thing, but I want students to think about why they're doing it and what they might be contributing to their beauty ideal. It's their job to think about that, because it's them who are going to go into the industry, and they might be contributing to something, not knowingly, they might be just doing it because they have no idea why they're doing it. But it's important to understand why you're doing something and what you might be contributing, and you might be fueling the problem to be a problem in the future.
Not necessarily realizing it. I have a question, maybe you'd like to take this, Diana. One of the last presenters discussed fashion clothing as a means of protection, and I'd be curious how beauty practices can draw parallels to fashion as a means of protection.
I think, well, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are direct parallels even from the earliest of times. So if you take a hairstyle, and Paula mentioned this, cane row, some people call it cornrow, the very braiding that is tight to the head, for those that might not be aware. That was used as first and foremost as a protective hairstyle to protect the hair. And then throughout the age of slavery, it became to hide things in that protective hairstyle, hid seeds, hid gold, hid where people were migrating and moving around. It was hiding bits of things. At times it was used so you can see the tracks and these wonderful creations that you see now that I can't do. So hat off to Paula and all the guys in the jail. You know, if I spent long enough, we all can, but I've just got to say big shout out to anyone that can. The various mapping that you see in the head, that was actual, you know, that they were routes to be taken. So it was a language, it was very protective, something that, you know, slave owners or those that would be, you know, a threat to them could not understand. So it was very many different things.
It was a language.
And yes, completely. And when I think back to school, you know, we're looking at beauty practices. One of the things that my mother used to do, again with the hair, on occasion, when it came to school, I'd have my Afro puffs. Not very often, because there'd always be a story when I came home, and she would have known this as well, being a parent at that time, of someone who did something, not only just said, but did something with the hair when it was out. And on one occasion, I had my hair cut by a parent in school at the age of 5, you know, so it was braiding all the way through school. And that was, again, a form of protection. And also, if we look at something more controversial in terms of protection, skin bleaching in the beauty industry as well, you know, as being part of, for some, wanting to be accepted is another form. I mean, you know, Lindsay touched upon some really interesting and very complex ideas away from what seems really obvious, which is, you know, one of the really wonderful things about that presentation. And the beauty industry and hair and makeup is no different.
And fascinating what she said in the film about how the sales in straightening products has just dived, or whatever the word is. But you question whether that's fashion or whether that's actual, or whether it's an actual direct thought that has produced.
I think it's a direct thought. I mean, those products are hugely damaging to the hair. So whether you wear your hair out naturally, whether it's in parts, when I mean naturally, if you have it straightened and you have it styled and wear it out, or for some extensions, you can have partial relaxers done, it is damaging. So where you have the emergence of lace front wigs, different types of extensions, I mean, it's just incredible, really exciting if you want to switch it up. And also it protects the hair as well. So you know, you can have a really great unit, you know, or hairpiece wig that is straight without, and the same length as your hair would be, without going through the whole process of using such toxic chemicals on your hair.
Which goes towards the whole environment and in you know, everyone being more caring and more understanding of our whole planet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great question. Yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately, it's 3:20. And that means that I'm going to hand over now. But thank you so much, Paula. If you're still can see us, thank you so much.
I'm still here. Yeah.
Mina, you've been amazing. And we're now going to have a 30-minute break before we come back. So thank you, everyone.
Okay. Hi everyone. So welcome back. My name's Elizabeth Katesco, and I'm really pleased to introduce our two speakers in the next session. So our first speaker is Dr. Florentina Andreescu, whose paper is titled War in a Society of Spectators. Florentina, her research combines insights from the study of politics, global economy, and psychoanalysis to investigate issues of radical social change, embodiment, social trauma, and identity. She's published widely in scholarly journals and is the author of From Communism to Capitalism, Nation and State in Romanian Cultural Production, as well as being the co-editor of Genre and the Post-Communist Woman, Analyzing Transformations of the Central and Eastern European Female Ideal. And she is currently working on a new book manuscript, which I actually really can't wait to read. That's called Embodiment and Global Capitalism. And then our second speaker, who isn't able to join us today, but has pre-recorded her lecture for us, is called Dr. Irene Günther, and her paper is titled Fashion in the Rubble of War, Germany 1945 to 1949. Dr. Günther has published on a number of topics, including the Nazi takeover of the German Jewish fashion industry, the contested politics of women's clothing in the 4 occupied zones of Germany after World War II, magical realism from 1920s Germany to 1940s Latin America, and the anti-war artists of the First World War. Her first book, Nazi Chic, Fashioning Women in the Third Reich, won the Costume Society of America's Melia Davenport Publication Award for Best Fashion History Book of the Year, and the Sierra Prize given by the Western Association of Women Historians. Her second book, Postcards from the Trenches, A German Soldier's Testimony of the Great War, was published in late 2018 and was accompanied by a centennial exhibition of World War I soldiers' art. She has also received numerous teaching and faculty awards. So before I hand over to our first speaker, I just want to remind you to put any questions or comments that you might have in the chat. Okay, so Florentina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Okay, perfect. So the paper I'm presenting today is entitled War in a Society of Spectators, Ukraine 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine shocked the global community with a sudden outpour of raw violence and destruction. The defacement of everyday life is seen across Ukraine, with lifeless bodies of civilians scattered on the streets, children injured and killed by shelling, mass graves and numerous buildings devastated. The torment of suffering, according to philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, is most unbearable when it is not given a meaning, when one realizes that it is absolutely for nothing. Not only is this war absurd and the violence unexplained, but it is also not acknowledged by those in whose name it is conducted, as its reality is mostly absent from Russians' awareness. The portrayal of war in Russian media contrasts sharply with the images and information available throughout the rest of the world. For instance, an internet search on the town of Bucha on Google returns images of destruction and death, while on Yandex, the search engine used by Russians, returns images of an unmarred happy town. In this context, the paper meditates on the conditions of possibility for such a sharp disconnect to take place. Humanity reached a stage when a significant part of our lives take place in the virtual space, where the information about concrete aspects of the world, often blends with fantasy. Accessing both reality and fantasy through screens unavoidably weakens our ability to discern the separation between the two. The unprecedented expansion of social media infiltrates even the ethos of the state and transforms the role of the citizen in that of a spectator. Political engagement morphs into the passive stance of an observer, seeking within the political spectacle both amusement and existential validation. As the attention of our contemporary society is mainly directed towards representations at the expense of the world itself, the representation becomes privileged. This in turn alters human experiential stance. To understand this alteration, I engage with the work of psychiatrist Jan McGilchrist and clinical psychologist Louise Sass. Discussion of schizophrenia is impacting not only singular individuals, but also the societal level. McGilchrist distinguishes between the left and the right hemispheres of our brain's mode of engaging with the world. The right hemisphere perceives individual entities as belonging to a contextual whole from which they cannot be divided. Its field of attention shows the ability of integration and recognition of complex patterns. It also deals preferentially with subjective lived experiences. By contrast, the left brain hemisphere deals with a represented version of our embodied experience, containing static, separate, but essentially fragmented entities. This kind of attention isolates, fixes, and makes things explicit. In doing so, it renders everything inert, mechanical, and lifeless. Human experience transferred on the two-dimensional virtual space disproportionately relies on the logic of the left brain hemisphere. Both McGilchrist and Sass share the concern that an increased reliance on the left hemisphere leads also to an increase in the prevalence of schizophrenia and schizophrenic-like predispositions. Schizophrenia's psychopathological features include a sort of misplaced hyper-rationalism and a disengagement from emotion and embodied existence. The world is stripped of its usual meaning and sense of coherence. Subjects in this state say that they find themselves akin to scientists, not involved in the world, but merely observing it from outside to understand its secret workings. In schizophrenia, one might feel that there is no access to an outside of the realm of the social authority, which in Lacanian psychoanalysis is referred to as the big other, and its overarching power of representation. In such a world, one oscillates between two apparently opposite positions: impotence, accompanied by dysphoria, and omnipotence, accompanied by an euphoric exaltation. Namely, either there is no self, as all there is appears to be structured by the deadening law of the other, or all that one sees appears to be in fact part of the self. As in this case, the schizophrenic identifies with the pervasive gaze of the other. The disconcerting oscillation between euphoria and dysphoria brings insights into Russian society's attachment to the world designed around it to a large extent by Vladimir Putin. Bare-chested Putin, with his predilection for horseback riding, hunting, ice swimming, and judo fighting, is a perfect embodiment of the traditional paternal authority. That is the pivotal figure of generating meaning and sustaining the social order. There. Thank you very much. Can I start now?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So I was mentioning that Vladimir Putin stands for the paternal authority within Russian society. And No, he is the commander of the largest nuclear weapon arsenal on this planet. He envisions himself as holding in his hands the future of the entire humanity. Putin asserts both his supreme right and desire to shape the discourse through which his supporters understand the past, the present, and the future, the distinction between true and false, as well as the distinction between real and artificial. Indeed, he sees himself as a mythical hero, as a historian destined to rewrite national history in his own image. To that end, he wrote an essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which was published on Kremlin's webpage. The essay informed Putin's televised speech announcing the invasion of Ukraine. With this occasion, he proclaimed Ukrainian identity as a distortion of genuine Russian identity and the Ukrainian state as artificial. Next slide, please. The Russian universe of conspiratorial narratives construed the world as burdened by malevolent figures such as Nazis, drug addicts, and corrupt Western leaders. Russian government worked intensely on developing a sense of mistrust in Western media and institutions starting as early as 1980s, when Radio Moscow broadcasted claims that the CIA invented AIDS as a weapon against Africa. More recently, it claimed that the US is collecting Russian DNA to create gene weapons and that the US is encircling Russia with secret biological labs. Their imminent sense of doom resonates with end-of-the-world experiences. These are culminations of sinister mood states and are also associated with the sense of being somehow at the center of these dreadful happenings. What stands out is the chilling detachment, the chilling attitude that is maintained when contemplating end-of-the-world scenarios. This is the case as the inner life of a schizophrenic is devoid of regular emotions like sadness and joy, and instead is infused with cosmic euphoria, anxiety, and ironic detachment. It is not uncommon for someone in this state of mind to describe the most horrific catastrophes with utter indifference or even a trace of a smile. For instance, we witness a chilling emotional detachment when envisioning the catastrophic destruction of the entire human civilization inflicted by Sarmat, the new Russian intercontinental ballistic missile. The TV hosts on Russia 1 were giggling as they were envisioning striking and destroying New York City in its entirety with this weapon. The casual conversations about apocalyptic forms of destruction gaining momentum in Russia show a profound lack of empathy that is indeed sinisterly cold and frightening. The exposure of the Western doom is followed by Putin's promise of a return to a state of plenitude, of an imperial Russia, as he positions himself as both Russia's and Ukraine's sole savior. The more threatening and confusing the world appears, the heavier is Russia's reliance on the apparent strength and of this mythological other. McGill-Chris claims that people with left brain deficit show a tendency towards confabulating. The failure of the right hemisphere to ground the self into an embodied flow of life generates a need for closure, as well as an acute intolerance to ambiguity. Hence, one of the appealing features of Russian conspiratorial narratives is the fact that they are akin to simple maps that claim to contain and expose the bare truth about human society and existence, as if this were transparent, quite similar to a schizophrenic who describes the feeling of a crystal clear sight, of profound penetration into the essence of things. Succumbing to this conspiratorial universe of meaning further distorts one's thinking and perception of the world. Its inherent ontological confusion enables the formation of what's called an unreality vision. Louis Sass argues that unreality vision is the main symptom of schizophrenia, and it's a strange and enigmatic mood that generates an utterly diminished feel of reality. It reveals an alien world of precision and clarity, but devoid of emotional resonance and sense of human purpose. Life is rendered flimsy and false. People and places appear devoid of depth and authenticity. Objects take on the look of stage accessories. People could seem more puppets or mannequins, or else somehow in disguise. Slide 5, please, or 6. Thank you. Kremlin insists that Western media has been broadcasting images and videos of crisis actresses and actors and war film sets as real events. Crisis actors refer to people who are merely playing the role of terrified or deceased war victims for the cameras. For instance, this accusation was used to neutralize the emotional impact of the images of an attack on a maternity in Mariupol. Russian social media claimed that the images of an injured pregnant woman being carried out on a stretcher and of another pregnant woman photographed fleeing the destroyed maternity building were both performances of the same actress, who was pretending for the camera to be injured when in fact she was well and happy. We see at play here the process of devitalization associated with the unreality vision, as people are rendered inauthentic. In addition, fragmentation, another process associated with schizophrenia, is present. Fragmentation results from a loss of global perception and contextual understanding. In the case discussed here, bringing attention to various distracting elements and disputing their authenticity diverts attention from the horrendous act of attacking pregnant women and newly born children to disputing the credibility of the pregnant women suffering. Because the pain of war victims is difficult to convey as explicit facts, the aim is to cloud people's thinking about the war. Fragmentation renders things overwhelmingly confusing and stifles the empathic bond that one might develop with the pain of the Ukrainians. The disinformation about the attack on maternity in Mariupol is unfortunately not an isolated case. This technique has been employed repeatedly in the Ukrainian war. The resulting impaired capacity to tell apart fake from reality became so acute in Russian society that it impacts the ability to empathize with and care for members of one's own family. What especially stands out to me are the stories of those finding themselves in Ukraine during bombardments and calling their relatives living in Russia to share their distress and receive solace, only to encounter a stubborn distrust of their war experiences. Ukrainians describe anger and frustration as they are put in the situation of needing to prove the authenticity of their pain. McGilchrist argues that in schizophrenia, there is a curious demand for proof of aspects of life that need to be implicit. How exactly could one clearly prove that one is suffering or demonstrate the authenticity of one's lived experience? What was once intuitively understood is forced out of its context and could be accessed only rationalistically. The tacit becomes focal, the implicit becomes explicit, and what should be intuitively grasped becomes a matter of calculation. Thus, the nature of implicit subjective experience at the core of human mode of being in the world is rendered inaccessible. For instance, Alexander Serdyuk has stopped talking to his mother, who, according to Alexander, she doesn't understand me. She says it's just Nazis killing each other and that we are responsible for all this. A young man from Kharkiv speaks of his frustration. They don't believe this war is real. They believe we are bombing ourselves and that our government is on drugs. As Ukrainian forces liberated areas around Kyiv, numerous bodies of civilians were found scattered in the streets of the town of Bucha. The last slide, please. Confronted with horrific scenes, Moscow rejected any involvement in atrocities. Russian officials and press argued instead that the images and videos were staged by Ukrainians with the use of crisis actors. Russia's embassy in France posted on Twitter a photo of the destruction in Bucha, claiming that it shows a film set. The Russian utter neglect of human suffering reminds of the account of a head-injured soldier, according to whom the entire First World War, in which he did participate, was a make-believe elaborate performance. Another noteworthy reaction to this incident comes from Russian talk show host Olesya Loseva, who suggested that the town of Bucha had deliberately been chosen as the setting for staging horrific scenes, because of the American president Joe Biden had previously used the word butcher to describe Vladimir Putin as a butcher. So for Americans, this word should be clear, she says. We see at play here another feature of the schizophrenic pathology. This is an abnormally heightened awareness of significance, termed the Apophonous mood. In this mood, every detail takes on excruciatingly specialness and peculiarity, as one starts seeing patterns and meaning into unrelated things. Hence, a bizarre association is made between the unrelated town Bucha and the world butcher. This association is endowed with a sense of special meaning and elevated importance, to the extent that it promises to open an apparent path into seeing the essence of the events analyzed. In this section of my paper, I reflected on the surreal representation of Ukrainian war in Russian media. Socialized in a universe of propaganda and conspiracy theories, the Russian citizenry appears simultaneously cynical and gullible, and above all, highly receptive to Kremlin's manipulations. Succumbing to this conspiratorial universe of meaning alters one's perception of the world. Thus, on the one hand, the feeling of reality is diminished to the extent that the Ukrainian people's war suffering is rendered merely a performance by crisis actors, while the extensive destruction of Ukrainian cities is seen as a stage film set. On the other hand, the feeling of reality is heightened and charged with mysterious signification, generating a sense of crystal clear sight into the nature of politics and society. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Florentina. So now we will go to our second speaker, Irene Günther.
Thank you for including me in this conference. It's a privilege to be a participant. Because my topic is focused on women in the post-war period in Germany, I want to make the following note, which is that I will only briefly touch on German Jewish women in the post-war period, which deserves its own conference, much less a talk. And in the 20 minutes that I'm allotted, I simply don't have the time to delve into that very weighty and important topic. With that said, I'd like to share my screen and get started. Reflecting back on the condition of Germany at the end of the war, the German-Swiss philosopher Karl Jaspers remarked, "The Germans had lost almost everything: their country, their economy, their physical security. Worse still was the loosening of uniform and unifying norms, of moral dignity, of self-confidence as a people. At 0 hour, in May 1945, the center of Berlin had been turned into a smoking wasteland. More than half of all the buildings were irretrievably destroyed. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble. There was no drinking water, no electricity, and no gas. The streets were littered with bombed out tanks, burned streetcars, and dead bodies." Following the war, Germany was occupied by 4 powers: all of whom had varying ideas about cultural policies to enact in their prescribed zones. Additionally, the four powers faced the enormous practical task of feeding and clothing a defeated and largely destroyed nation. Especially in medium and large-sized cities, the devastation and material scarcity seemed insurmountable. 2 years after the war's end, the inhabitants of occupied Germany could find scant signs of recovery. The majority of people continued to live in the cellars of bombed-out houses or in corners of roofless buildings, and often subsisted on less than 1,000 calories a day. The policy of minimally feeding the Germans was intended to, quote, teach them a lesson in civilized behavior, according to the Allies. But that lesson was rife with the obvious paradox that teaching democratic principles by example could not at the same time entail rebuffing the Germans' desperate need for food. Even 3 years after the war's end, an American journalist reporting from Berlin noted, the Germans are a ruined, poverty-stricken, brutalized people with little to eat, everything to fear, and nothing to hope for. While hunger was the chief catastrophe, clothing, shoes, and textiles were just as scarce. Many mothers, a health official reported, must wrap their infants in newspaper because they have no scraps of material large enough to serve as makeshift diapers. An official survey published in the American Zone in 1947 noted, on the basis of current production levels in the Western zones, every inhabitant, with the exception of minors and other priority groups, can expect the following each year: 340 grams in textiles, every 4 years, 1 pair of shoes, and in all eternity, no toothbrush and no shaving brush. Germany seemed stuck at 0 hour. Material misery, the Western occupiers finally concluded, was an impediment to morale, to order, to democratization, and the cultural reconstruction of Germany. In the midst of such wretchedness and deprivation, the occupying forces in each zone hosted all sorts of events to entertain and to teach the occupied the cultural and political values of the occupier. Art exhibits, music concerts, plays, and various forms of print media aim to illuminate to the occupied the cultural values and political ideologies of the occupier. Incredibly, more than 1,000 art exhibits were held in Germany in the 4 years after the war's end. Classical music concerts and jazz sessions, often performed in bombed-out buildings and clubs, also mushroomed in post-war Berlin. Competing against each other for the Germans, the occupiers used music and art for the projection of rival cultural ideals. I argue that fashion too played a role on the cultural front lines of post-war Germany. The occupiers' project was directed specifically at women. Already by August 1945, in the face of great hunger and need, the occupiers organized or approved the first post-war fashion shows. Additionally, they published the first fashion magazines, scant in pages, which offered clothing tips for life in the ruins, along with illustrations of the newest fashions being worn by the war's winners in Paris, London, and New York. At the same time, women took up their own self-fashioning project. On the surface, such superficialities of everyday life might seem unimportant, distracting, and even egregious, given the barely ended World War and horrific genocide, as well as the challenges of survival in a destroyed country. Yet examining those very aspects amid catastrophe could tell us a great deal. Clothing human beings was a serious practical matter, given the drastic material shortages and the countless bombed out people. Additionally, fashioning good German citizens was a serious cultural project, one that sought to drape a particular identity onto the bodies of a defeated people. Intertwined with these larger matters is the refashioning that German women intentionally undertook. With so many men dead, imprisoned, or injured, Women dominated everyday life in the months and years after the war. They set up temporary living quarters in largely destroyed cities. They searched for water and food. They collected wood and lugged it in prams and handcarts through the barely passable streets. They cared for their children, cleared debris, and cooked what they could. Many hours were consumed standing in queues for rations, obtaining living space, participating in the black market, and trading in barter centers, which were officially established in September of 1945 by the occupiers in an attempt to deal with the burgeoning black market. The Allies' initiatives, which, as they stated, prioritized the revival of industrial production over human regeneration and minimized production for domestic consumption, massively increased women's burdens. Yet because women dominated the landscape of post-war Germany, it was crucial to win their hearts and minds. They were deemed vital to the project of transforming enemy into ally, especially as the ideological and political divisions between East and West deepened. In post-war Germany, clothing, much like food and shelter, was almost non-existent. Also similar to food, clothing, or having the material goods to clothe oneself, translated into physical survival, defense against moral humiliation, and bargaining power on the black market. On the other hand, fashion was viewed as an important economic industry and cultural site, while self-fashioning was the means by which German women reimagined themselves. In the months following Germany's unconditional surrender, a large number of women on the home front were spotted wearing dirtied and torn military jackets, which German soldiers and officers had hastily abandoned in their retreat or had been killed in, as well as the civilian trousers of their dead husbands, the waists tied with string or curtain cords so that the pants would not fall down. On their heads were kerchiefs, which served to cover their dirty, unkempt hair, made from fabric scraps or remnants of Nazi flags, and on their feet were dilapidated shoes or the much too large boots of a male relative who did not return home from the war. Forming human chains to clear away the bomb damage inflicted on streets, buildings, and homes, the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, dotted the disfigured landscape of German cities. In Berlin alone, over 50,000 rubble women worked to clear the streets, remove the debris of destroyed houses, and refurbish old bricks to be used in the city's resurrection. The resounding female image of the post-war period was a fashion of defeat. Women recalled the depressing dinginess and fear that had colored their lives during the past years. A group of them remembered, "We were hungry for bright colors. Everything was gray, dusty, and dirty. Everywhere ruins and rubble. Most of us looked and smelled terrible." Well into 1948, women had been washing and wearing the same pair or two of underwear since midway through the war. Once underclothing was offered again in the stores, one woman described it as heaven on earth. Many women at most had 2 changes of clothes, one of which usually consisted of worn, tattered men's pants. Potato sacks were made into blouses, flags and parachutes into skirts and hair scarves. Horse blankets were transformed into coats, and Allied burlap sugar sacks were unraveled and crocheted into sanitary napkins and underwear. Soap was almost impossible to procure, so housewives learned to wash their darker garments in an infusion of ivy leaves and boil light-colored garments in potato peels, if those were even available. Despite all of the obstacles, women did what they could to refashion themselves, from war to post-war, from defeat to rebirth. Left to their own devices, they created a female fashioning of their own making. "We had to," one woman recalled, "trying to stay clean or to look nice in even the smallest way made us feel better in all of that grimness. While this impulse could be interpreted as a grasp at normality or as a form of escapism from the horrors committed during the war and the destruction that surrounded them afterwards, it could also be interpreted as a way of asserting even a semblance of control over their lives. Fueled by great desire and need, the first post-war German fashion emerged. Its creator, designer Walter Schulz, noted that the fashion was born from necessity and fueled by ingenuity. His Flickenkleid, as it was called, a patchwork dress made from dozens of scraps of material, was heralded as a big splash in the first tiny post-war fashion show held in Schulz's salon in Berlin on September 8, 1945, just 4 months after the war's end. Accessorizing the Flickenkleid were gloves crocheted from the threads of unraveled Allied sugar sacks. In one of her hands, the model held a purse. The new post-war lady's handbag was woven from the face straps of abandoned gas masks. Ingenuity also occurred outside of Schulz's salon. One woman knitted her first post-war sweater from the silk straps of a fallen parachute. Another woman scraped together the very last bit of money she had to buy material on the black market to sew what she called a redemptive peacetime dress. A third woman recounted that she made a skirt from a torn uniform and embroidered flowers across the hem to make it look a little better. Many women made new garments from old uniforms, but because the occupiers prohibited the German military uniform as civilian clothes in its present color, women had to create fabric dye to convert the uniform's color by the occupiers' deadline of December 1st, 1945. Beetroot peel turned the uniforms red, birch leaves yellow-green, walnut shells or alder bark turned the uniforms a strange shade of dark brown. This denazification of clothing, as the occupiers called it, was also how they dealt with the critical shortage of textiles in all 4 zones and the need to clothe thousands upon thousands of displaced persons, returning prisoners of war, former internees, and local officials after their rehabilitation. Nonetheless, the clothing crisis continued. So, 800,000 grain and flour sacks were released from US Army stocks, from which women sewed underwear, diapers, and shirts for children. Thousands of British uniforms and army blankets were sent to Germany, along with patterns, to be refashioned into civilian clothing. Notably, in the midst of such destruction and need, the first fashion magazine appeared, if it could even be called that, comprised of 4 pages, printed on the thinnest of paper, with 2 hand-drawn illustrations. The caption read, "Do you remember?" One woman recalled, "We looked at it and stared with equal amounts of disbelief and desire." Women's magazines appeared in increasingly large numbers in the Western zones. At first, such magazines were comprised of few pages. The images were badly reproduced and the contents uneven. But by late 1949, the most successful of these magazines boasted 50 pages per issue, glossy covers, colored photos, wide-ranging articles, and a huge amount of advertisement. They peddled clothing and consumer products aimed at female readers, few of whom could have afforded to purchase those products, even if they had been available, which they were not. Even so, the images offered a return to normality and hope for a better tomorrow, fueled consumptive desires, and were replicated in various ways by women who understood the transformative power of fashion. In 1949, 4 years after the war, and only 2 months after the Soviets called off the Berlin blockade, a reporter from the Manchester Guardian observed, "The face of Berlin has changed almost beyond recognition. One Berliner to whom I spoke was lyrical about it. The face of Berlin, he said, was once the face of the middle-aged, weather-beaten woman in patched dungarees who stacked bricks along the edges of the city's shattered streets. And now it's the face of a young woman, eager, excited, in a summery frock and sandals. The reporter continued, the sandals may indeed be an integral part of the new spirit of optimism which has pervaded Berlin since the blockade was lifted. Berlin women's fashion has burgeoned into resort beach pajamas, radically intricate hairstyles, and sandals with 10-centimeter stilt-like cork heels or thin rubber boogie-woogie soles. By all accounts, they are shockingly expensive and no woman can afford to buy them. Yet they all do. By 1949 then, the transformation of the stereotype German female image seemed complete. From the unfashionable, braid-wearing, cosmetics-free, wide-hipped Nazi Hausfrau to the rebel women dressed in the ragged, cast-off clothing of the defeated German male, and on to the supremely fashionable woman of the West German post-war success story. The Soviets' blockade had transformed the relationship between West Berliners and Americans, from military occupation to humanitarianism. That, combined with the end of the blockade, had changed the spirit, if not the face, of West Berlin. Additionally, the Marshall Plan was transforming the city's western zones as well as the nation. Beauty contests also resumed in the post-war years, with Miss Stuttgart winning the national crown in March 1949. By then, the Cold War had heated up dramatically and the division of Germany loomed. Even so, interest in the competition was so great that the magazine Constantino reported, it has appeared for weeks as though the fate of German women, mothers, and families is being decided not in the heated parliamentary debates occurring in Berlin, but the fresh meat parades at the contest. In September 1950, the first Miss Germany contest took place in the newly established Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. 24-year-old Susanne Eriksson from Berlin won the contest. Again, the public's fervor for the competition, as well as for Eriksson herself, was immense, as photos of her appeared in dozens of women's magazines throughout Europe and the United States. When Eriksson appeared 2 years later in New York as ambassador of German fashion, and she modeled the collections of Berlin's best couture houses in the fall fashion shows, the American press was rapturous in its praise. Life, Time, and Vogue each devoted 3 to 4 page spreads to Eriksson and the fashions of Berlin designers. She was described as the embodiment of the new German female miracle. Quote, her beauty and charm make her a better diplomat for the Federal Republic's integration into the West than that nation's best politicians. The quote goes on, she illuminates the transformation of the German woman from an ugly duckling into a stylish, beautiful woman, a Fräuleinwunder, a female miracle. In turn, the German fashion press called Eriksson, quote, the key to the country's economic miracle, a female Wirtschaftswunder. Her successes in the United States signaled a triple victory. There was, of course, the personal victory for Eriksson, whose post-war experience echoed those of so many young German women. Forced transport to the Soviet Union at 20 years of age, hard labor for 2 years in Soviet labor camps under the watchful eye of armed Russian guards, great hunger, homesickness, and fear in the months following the war's end. The Soviets returned Eriksson to Germany in 1947 because by then she had become so ill and emaciated that she couldn't work in the limestone quarries. With no possessions but the clothes she was wearing, she was discovered by a fashion editor in Munich in 1948. She began a modeling career, which, after her win in the Miss Germany contest and her New York success quickly broadened into an international career. Additionally, her victory was an economic and cultural one for the Berlin fashion industry, whose acclaimed design she wore first during the beauty competition and then modeled for more than 2,000 spectators in 3 fashion shows in New York. Berlin designers who had struggled in the post-war years because of bombed out facilities, great material shortages, the 14th-month Soviet blockade of the city, and enemy designation until they could prove that they had not collaborated with the Nazis, finally began receiving large orders from new clients abroad. Notably, Ericsson's victory also signaled the enthusiastic acceptance of the refashioned German woman who had in 4 years transformed herself from enemy to ally, from Nazi woman and rebel woman to American beauty ideal. As the Allies advanced against the German army and more concentration camps were liberated, some of the surviving women who were physically able to stormed their camps, SS headquarters. Once inside, they took tablecloths with which they fashioned their first post-war dress or skirt, not only because they needed the clothing, but because that was a tangible way for them to reassert their power. At the same time, the material came from their liberators, Allied soldiers who distributed bolts of fabric for the former prisoners to sew themselves something to wear. Because they had been stripped of everything that was theirs upon entering the camps, these liberation dresses often became treasured possessions due to their weighty significance. One woman who barely survived her malnourishment and ill treatment in the various concentration camps she went to felt that her war was won the day she and several other female prisoners broke into the recently abandoned SS camp office and tore the curtains from their rods. On her journey to find surviving family members, she took with her one of those curtains from which she fashioned her first post-war dress. She named it her victory dress. When I interviewed her in 2006, she took a box from underneath her bed and slowly opened it. Neatly folded in tissue was the 60-year-old dress. She told me that whenever she felt hopeless in the decades following the war, she would wear it because it always made her feel better. Given how thin the fabric had become in several places, it was clear that she had worn her victory dress many, many times during those difficult years. Another woman whom I interviewed spent the war years on the home front, doing her best to ensure the survival of her 4 children. Towards the end of the war, her husband was killed, but she was nonetheless grateful that at least his body had been returned to be buried, which was highly unusual at the time, given how many soldiers were dying on the front lines. Soon after we met, she pulled out of her closet a garment bag from which she took a Wehrmacht uniform jacket, obviously hand altered in size and hand dyed, and with hand stitched flowers covering bullet holes and blood stains. She lifted up the jacket for me to see and then wrapped it around her aging frame as if to comfort herself yet again. Fashion played a major role in the occupiers' policies and in the personal reconstruction that German women undertook after the war. Women shaped the way their identities were exerted through fashion, whether by securing access to limited supplies of textiles and clothing, or by what they wore and the impact of their appearance on themselves and on others. If the saying is true, the clothes make the woman, then in the devastation that characterized post-war Berlin, clothing the naked and defeated became the means to restore human dignity to concentration camp survivors, displaced persons, refugees, and Berliners bereft of food, shelter, and other basic necessities. Clothing also offered the means to peel away former identities and to construct new ones through the removal or refashioning of uniforms, worn-torn garments, and other sartorial signifiers. That fashion would matter at all amid questions of life and death may strike a lot of people as absurd. A 2018 report, however, asserted that in almost every country currently categorized as a danger zone, there is fashion. After being told that her show had the highest popularity ratings, a reporter who covered French fashion for Lebanese television audiences during that country's lengthy and deadly civil war noted, "Fashion is like a flower in a vase. It helps you forget the horrors of yesterday and cope with tomorrow." After the Second World War in the ravaged city of Berlin, clothing and the fashions it engendered empowered the vulnerable, created a mirage of normality during catastrophe, and nourished hope when there was little to be had. The self-fashioning Berlin's women undertook was comprised of necessity, desire, distraction, willful amnesia, purposeful reconstruction, and sartorial gesture. The good and beauty would prevail over hatred and ugliness. As they sought to wrap a new external image around their defeated and demoralized bodies, women began to bridge the divide between occupier and occupied. At the same time, they healed their shattered psyches. Understanding the power of fashion, women utilized their self-fashioning to grieve, to remember, to forget, and to contest, defy, and transform the abject material, physical, and spiritual conditions that surrounded them for a long, long time. Thank you very much.
I just want to say, Florentina, because you're here, I thought your paper was so interesting. And I think this kind of idea that the citizen has been replaced with the spectator, it really made me think of something that Wim Wenders was writing about, how, you know, the whole way that we engage with images has fundamentally shifted because we use them now to kind of say, look, like to send them off somewhere. But we're not kind of interested in the actual composition or the frame of the image itself. And I wanted to, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about this kind of idea of social schizophrenia, because I'm kind of, I suppose I was thinking about how maybe it could be applied in other areas sort of beyond, well, maybe you can elaborate on that a bit, because it's also something somebody mentioned in a comment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if we have time, because I see that you guys are starting a keynote presentation at 45 or...
Okay.
But yes, of course, it can be applied beyond what I have discussed. And the two books that I mentioned that belong to psychiatrist Iain McGilchrist and psychologist Louise Sass, they're excellent in presenting how our entire society is moving towards a place where we see a lot of schizophrenic predispositions, meaning a kind of disconnect from embodied life, embodied experience, and becoming more rationalistic, more hyper-rationalistic, and focus more on images and representation. As I'm presenting in my paper, now I'm talking in my paper, one distrusts experiencing the real if the representation is different. So the representation becomes privileged as most real, most valid. It's a lot to say.
Do you think there's any way we can crawl back from that?
I don't know. I don't know. It's pretty difficult because that's the trend. That's where we are going. And I was trying to imagine if I have any proposal at the end of the paper, and I do not. I'm just reflecting on what's going on. And it's not only about the Ukrainian war. I would say that this confusion, ontological confusion about reality, manifests in other ways. For example, about the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, when many people basically did not believe was happening. We're living in a very different world. In the United States, with the election for the presidency, many people believed that they were rigged. The results are not correct based on no evidence whatsoever. So we have this ontological confusion where it's very hard for us to tell the distinction between what's real and what's artificial, what is true and what is false anymore.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over. Thank you so much, Florentina. And
thank you very much.
Thank you to Irene too.